Good morning. It's a little loud. I'd like to call our May 14th meeting of the Higher Education Strategic Planning Committee to order. Trying to stay on schedule as we have in the past. I want to thank you again for your commitment to Texas and for your leadership as we work together to provide the Coordinating Board's advice and recommendations regarding the development of the next long-term strategic plan. This is our 13th committee meeting, so I think you've heard that statement 13 times now. It is anticipated that the Coordinating Board's quarterly meeting on July 23rd of this year, our committee will present our final recommendations for the goals, targets, and strategies for the next plan to the board for consideration and adoption as modified on the basis of solicited input from stakeholders. I guess one thing, and maybe Raymond, you can tell us, is are we anticipated on July 23rd for the whole committee, the committee of the whole, to be there, or do you just want a representative to present the plan?
Well, I think it would be a good idea if we had as many members there as can make it, for a lot of obvious reasons, and for no other reason than to thank the members. Yeah. But I think I think whatever, the leadership, obviously, of the committee.
How much time would be allocated at that meeting for the presentation or approval, or what?
I would guess. I haven't seen the latest draft of the agenda, but I expect that we'll devote at least an hour to the presentation and to discussion. Okay. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions by board members.
So that's something that the committee can be thinking about. I'm sensitive to bringing the committee in the whole here for 1 hour versus 4 hours. On the other hand, everybody has spent over a year now working to bring this together, and certainly we're not going to deny the opportunity for
13 meetings.
Yeah, well, it'll be maybe 14 or 15 or 16 before we're finished. So in one sense, it would be good if everybody was there and we'd make their presentation, because everybody deserves to be there. On the other sense, I don't want people to feel required to be there, since the time allotment would not necessarily allow for a lot of participation, and it wouldn't be anywhere as long as a regular meeting. So if you got to travel, that's a lot of travel time for the 1 hour. So we'll just leave that as something for the staff to think about and give us a final recommendation on attendance.
But David might know already.
Yeah. So I hadn't told you yet. Our recommendation is that it be the major policy issue at the board meeting, which would mean we would have an hour to present, to discuss. If anybody from the field wanted to testify for or against, they would have that opportunity. But that's what we'd like to do. We think it should be the featured item. This is the most important thing they're going to do at the meeting. And so that's what we'd recommend.
What time of day is it?
It's in the morning.
8:30?
There's like 8:30 to...
Yeah, so the actual major policy issue would start a little bit later than that. What, normally about 9 o'clock?
9:15.
9:15. Mm-hmm. And if that was a travel issue, we could maybe put something right before it if we had to. But I think would be good if not all of you, most of you could be there, because this has been a lot of work. We've never had a group put in as much effort. I think Martin would know, even with closing the gaps, that we didn't have the same type of attendance consistently of everyone. And yeah, I think you should be very proud of the effort. We've gotten really good feedback. I was at a Lumina convening in Chicago 2 weeks ago when they were talking about, they wanted to know us to talk about our closing the gaps efforts, but they were very interested in this new plan as well and thought it was right on target. Again, one of the Georgetown staff was there, and he was impressed. Again, he was one of the people you have comments from in the document. And so now one thing you had talked with me briefly about is, should there be, and you may have said this before I came back into the room, but should, or to what, how many times, meaning 1 or 2, should this committee meet before the board meeting? And so what you have before you is comments we've received thus far. But the deadline is May 29th. And your next meeting is actually scheduled for June 4th. I know you're going to want to look at those comments. And if we get thousands, we'll, of course, summarize them for you. So a question would be, would you want to meet then, and then the next meeting would be the board meeting, or would you prefer to meet in July or make that June meeting later so that there would be more time for you to sort of consume what we're getting from the field?
Right.
And
So the staff needs to turn around, and presumably you could receive comments up to the 29th of May. Then you need
Correct.
to turn them around in time for us to be able to reflect on them.
Correct.
Hopefully before a meeting.
That's correct. And we're going to summarize, begin to aggregate them as they come in. So if in 2 weeks we have a number of significant remarks that have come in, I think what we should do is to summarize those at that point to send them to you, so you don't have to consume a massive amount at the same time. But despite the fact we've sent out thousands of drafts, literally, I suspect at best we'll get maybe a couple hundred responses. I mean, that's typically the case. And so then you always have to weigh what that means. So that will be your preference. We already discussed when we talked about that May 29th date. Could we turn it around soon enough for you for that June 4th meeting? We're committed to do that if you want to stay with that date.
Okay. So I think at the end of the meeting today, we'll revisit, after we see how things go today, we can revisit June 4th. The other scheduled meeting prior to the 23rd is July 9th, as I remember. So the question would be, if we didn't meet on June 4th and we continue to work by internet between this meeting and the 9th of July, would the time frame between the 9th and the 23rd allow any final changes that needed to be made after the 9th meeting?
And we have to get that date for you because we need to send any revision, especially any revision, period. But if it's a significant revision, it's important that our board have a chance to an adequate time to read it and review it.
So do you think the 9th is too close to the 23rd?
I think the 9th may be too close to allow that. If there are any significant changes, I don't really know, because you have to respond, and we'll provide our advice, but in the final analysis, it's your decision in terms of what to respond to from comments that come back in and not. Yeah. And some of them so far amount to even just phrasing. We had one help some with some edits, so that they can take the full range. But I suspect from institutional responses, so say from presidents or chancellors, if we get those, history would suggest they will be at the last minute.
Yeah.
Or even beyond.
Sorry to those of you that have been in that role, but they have a lot of things on their table, and the legislature is going on right now, so it's understandable.
So if we met on July 9th, you would envision that kind of being the final plan that we would sign off on, with not much to be changed between the 9th and the 23rd?
Yeah, I don't think we would have any time significantly to make any real changes at that point. So I think.
So the question of having a meeting on the 9th of July, that would once again bring everybody together. If we're not going to make any changes, that's a pretty big time commitment for everybody to be here.
If there were not going to be any changes, I don't see any point in getting back together. So part of it may be that your next meeting, if you have the next meeting, you'll know if they're really going to be what you think are significant changes or not. And wouldn't it be, so if we have say that you see no reason to meet again at all?
Yes. Right, so the alternatives that we're developing here would be not to meet again at all until the 23rd, but have interaction virtually, or to meet maybe at a date later than June 4th that would give the staff more time to prepare, but still be far enough away from the 23rd of July to incorporate whatever decisions are made at that.
Right, for you to have a chance to review it.
Right.
And then to send it to the board with enough time for them to adequately review it before the presentation. They have been very happy, the best I can tell, with what they've seen thus far, the current draft. So everyone so far seems impressed with what you're doing. Part of what's trickling up now is for some people is, what does this mean? What are they going to do to us? We have heard some things in terms of marketable skills where we think we can clarify this, and we'll talk about that today, that we think will alleviate some of the worries that I think some people think, and Rex could talk about this in more detail later, but that the coordinating board will be signing off on marketable skills for thousands and thousands of programs statewide, and at least that's not been our intent. Mm-hmm. So we need to make people comfortable with that. That would...
A couple of other issues this committee should know about, Woody. As you know, Senator Seliger, most of you know, Senator Seliger has got a bill that would tie the university's authority to raise tuition and fees to performance on certain metrics, and the metrics are very similar to the ones that we had recommended in our own outcomes-based funding proposal. But one of the provisions of that bill, assuming that it passes and isn't changed very much than its current shape, is that those performance standards and expectations that we help set for the universities will be tied, will be aligned to this strategic plan. And we've already, I talked to Senator Seliger about this, and he liked the idea very much. And he said as recently as yesterday, he told me that he thought it was very important for us to set standards for the universities that would make them stretch. Mm-hmm. And we said it's exactly what we have in mind. The other thing I wanted to mention is we've been in touch with the governor's staff about the status of the strategic plan, and I was told just a few days ago that it was more than likely that the governor would be very interested in having a public event and being present for the rollout of the strategic plan.
Well, as you remember I think it was our meeting, it was at the March meeting, and we attempted to engage with leadership at the committee levels, and it didn't work out too well. So, hopefully we could have an opportunity at some, because it's, once again, as we've commented, it's largely a political document to try to get, it needs political support to be successful. So hopefully post-legislative session, we'll have a chance to try to improve the connection with the leadership, or get them in a public way supportive of the outcomes of the plan.
Well, I think it's very significant. Of course, Senator Seliger can come to our meeting when we met at the Texas Workforce Commission and didn't send anybody, did he?
No.
There was nobody there, but he's very much aware of the plan, and I think it's a positive sign that he wants to tie the performance metrics to and put them in alignment with this strategic plan. So he's very much aware of the plan, and he's trying to make sure that we induce the universities to perform in a way that's commensurate with the plan.
Okay.
Zerwas is very much aware, yes. He's in sync, yes.
Ms. Steve?
For some of our institutions. Yeah, but for a couple of year stretches, it will be for holding them.
Level, I think, is to ensure success for some and ensure failure for others, and I think we really need to think about that.
Well, we're going to determine what the standards are. Once again, assuming that Seliger's bill is signed, makes it to the governor's desk and is signed by the governor. We are going to reach our goals for the individual institutions through negotiated rulemaking, and I can assure you the universities will be very much aware of their individual characteristics and will.
Well, I know they would be. I just want to make sure that
Are you talking about Seliger's bill now, or the plan?
I'm talking about Seliger's bill.
Okay, I just want to be sure. Okay, I understand in that context.
Yeah, that's. I just think that happens a lot in the state, in the
30-some years I've been here.
I think I can say one thing in relation to his bill. Because the bill is tied into whether they can increase their tuition fees. The institutions that we should be concerned about typically are not increasing their tuition fees in that same magnitude. So it puts more pressure on the institutions where it's easier to do it, in a sense. But it will make it more challenging for schools where they need, at least relative to other institutions, have lower tuitions, and when they need to raise them. Unfortunately, they're in a bit of a catch-22 situation in that their market won't allow them to increase their tuition fees anyway. So it almost goes beyond this to what is the funding through the formula period, and whether it's adequate and whether there are other resources for them, which I think is a great concern that you and I share. I think I'm really agreeing with you on this.
Okay. Well, I think once again we'll revisit the organizational issues we talked about. But I think it's a good discussion, because what we don't want to do is just have meetings to have meetings. We want to be productive, and we want to time that any additional meetings so that we can add the greatest value. And we know we've got an end date of the 23rd, and obviously we're getting closer to that. We don't want to get too close and find work undone. As mentioned here, on May 5th, through a webinar, the coordinating board staff presented an overview of our plan. 146 sites were in attendance. There will be additional webinars held specifically to explain the individual goals, targets, and strategy stakeholders on May 19th, 22nd, 26th, and 27th. So those could, I guess, engender more comments that would come in.
Definitely. Those are designed for individuals who may only be interested in, say, the debt goal, or may only be interested in the marketable skills or one of the others, so they can focus on that. I just want to make clear the first webcast laid out the entire plan.
Right.
And we had
the other four is one per goal.
Yes. It's with the idea if there's, say, people in the financial aid office might be more likely to attend the one discussing the debt goal, and be able to weigh in on more detailed questions than they might be comfortable with when you're talking about the overall plan.
Right. Okay. In your folder today is the agenda minutes from our April 9th meeting, the draft of our 60 by 30 Texas plan that has been, as we've discussed, widely distributed. An updated version of possible strategies document that you received electronically by email on Friday of last week. Some comments on the plan. And all materials distributed in the webinar. Staff requests that comments be received no later, as has been discussed, May 29th. And any additional comments will be shared with the Strategic Planning Committee at our June 4th meeting, but that might end up being later. In terms of our agenda today, after the approval of the minutes from our April 9th meeting, we'll begin our discussions of possible strategies for achieving the 4 goals and associated targets we have proposed, and we'll take a short break just before noon to retrieve our lunches before coming back together as a committee to continue our discussion. Dr. Faulkner is chair of an admissions review or reform committee for the UT system, is delivering that report this morning. As soon as he's finished, he'll join us, which I think was expected to be around noontime. And so let's go ahead and get started, and I'd entertain a motion for the minutes, approval of the minutes for April 9th meeting. Second? Made and second. Any opposed? None opposed. Motion passes. But finally, before we begin our discussions of strategies to achieve our goals, I want to let you know that, subject to confirmation by the Texas Senate, Governor Greg Abbott has appointed our fellow committee member Dee Margo to the Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of the Texas Oversight Committee for a term to expire January 31, 2021. So congratulations, Dee, on a new task in serving our state. To begin, I'd like to ask Deputy Commissioner David Gardner, Assistant Commissioner Susan Brown, Senior Director Ginger Grossman, and members of the staff members of the Strategic Planning and Funding Division and the College Readiness and Success Division to lead us in a discussion of the possible strategy for achieving our goals and targets. And this is we have no presenters today, so what we need is input and discussion. from our committee members. We also have Gerald Booker, who's Deputy Assistant Commissioner for College Readiness, and Kristen Kramer, who's Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Student Success, that have joined us today and are sitting on the podium. And with that, I will turn it over to David, Susan, Julie, Paul, et al.
Whoa. Okay, y'all are going through this really quick, so
yeah, I didn't anticipate you were going to be given everybody's names, so, but they've all contributed a lot, and some of them you haven't seen before. So before we start, I just want to announce that Susan Brown her last day at the coordinating board will be May 31st. She's going to work for UT Rio Grande Valley. Fortunately, she's resisted offers before, but she's going to work there as an associate vice president for, I don't remember the exact.
Assistant vice president.
Oh, it's assistant vice president.
Assistant vice president.
Okay, well, it changes from day to day.
Strategic analysis and institutional research, or reporting.
Reporting. So she'll be giving us trouble from the other side.
Yes, I will.
But
Thank you.
My family steals from the best.
I was telling Woody that I hired her as a data analyst 26 years ago, 27 for $26,000, and nobody's grown, and it's just amazing. And I think, after the 31st, it will be apparent that I have no ability whatsoever.
That's not
so
true.
I want to thank her for all that time and
Okay,
Susan.
So now we're going to talk about strategies. As you talk about this, we wanted to start by focusing on bringing back some of the things that we talked about at your very first meeting, which is what we want in a plan. It's how we're going to meet it and that sort of thing. So we're going to, we seem to be having something wrong with our plans. Oh, and here we go again. You have the handout because there is something wrong with our PowerPoint and it just keeps cycling through, so we're just going to go straight from the handout.
This is basically to remind you what type of plan the board anticipates that you're creating, and to show you that you've done it. And,
yes.
And also as a reminder that we're really today, you're talking about strategies, and we're talking about key critical strategies and strategies that will give us some flexibility to learn as we go forward, so that we're not restricted. We're going to do this one narrow thing, but we just want to make sure that as we go forward today, that you guys are comfortable with the strategies, or if there's some key strategy we're missing, that we get it's added in. And I was hoping to hear some from the field. Thus far, we've not had any suggestions for sort of critical, particular strategies.
Okay, and Julie says that they got it fixed.
General comment.
No, just a general comment as I was looking at these is, and part of what I said a minute ago was related to that, but I wonder the extent to which we want to take key groups that will be responsible for the success or failure of our plan in the long run, and to make these goals be such that my composition of my population does not determine 90% of my success. Meaning that if you take institutions, we know that our biggest challenges relate to Hispanic students, to African American students. And so if we leave everything kind of the way it is, if I'm at an institution that is primarily non-Hispanic white, I will have an advantage versus one that is more diverse. And I'm wondering if, as a result of that, we shouldn't be looking at these in maybe at a second level from these that are stated here, so that we look at achieving percentages among given groups, no matter what your enrollment base is. In other words, if it's 60% of a total students,
okay, and I'm primarily upper middle class, non-Hispanic white institution, I'm going to have a lot easier time than if I'm an institution in a very poor part of our state with kids who've had difficulty socioeconomically and otherwise in elementary and secondary school, let alone college. And what I'm worried about, as I reflected that in Raymond's comments was a little bit, is that we don't create in here by having just a raw percentage overall inequality in what is needed from me as an institution, depending on what my composition of my population is.
And I'll go back to, as we did close in the gaps, we set the statewide, and then when we got down to what each institution, kind of their fair share of what that would be, we took all of that into account. We looked at where they were, we did that. So we do that based on where they pull from, what their population looks like, and that's how we did kind of gave them, but they set their own targets. We did not set targets for the institution, and since I'll be at an institution, no. So
turn off her mic.
I mean that will be the impetus. We will also do. I'm still going to say we. We will also be looking at the population as we move forward. We will be looking at every 5 years, going back and looking at that population and making sure that it does reflect the current projections along with how each institution is doing and that sort of thing.
This is all right. I think that this reflects some of the comments we're receiving from the institutions. We need to make sure the document makes this point clear.
Yes.
Because this has been our practice, but I want to say to the credit of some of the institutions that you're addressing, that they largely made the greatest improvements of any of the institutions in the state, and the ones with the most resources. While they improved, there's less room to improve, but it was a lot of these other institutions, the UT Pan Americans, the A&M Internationals, that really showed the greatest improvement. And Texas State. And one reason why, with our accountability system, we'll have to decide how to do this. We deliberately structured that into different groups.
As long as you're doing that with each institution, but of course the point is that may all be true, and I'm not doubting at all that it is true, but where I start on this scale will make it differentially possible and me differentially successful. And all I'm trying to say is, if you do it by institution and you've got some systematic way, everybody gets treated fairly in that, and I'm sure you do, that's fine. I just was worried about the pure raw goal not taking into account the differentials across the state.
The goal very much took that into account. Remember, all of our data is based on individual students. We take into account all these in different institutions. So there's probably no group that knows more about the differences and successes and various things of individual institutions than our staff here, because we do it on a daily basis. So we have to make this clear in the plan.
Okay, that is not my point. It's not any criticism of you guys.
No, I'm not thinking it is.
But what it is simply a point that if we get stated in print without additional specification of the very things that you've just told us, we will have people in that little strange place over here that people are meeting. Is it that way? Yeah, that way. Who will literally interpret it and will.
So I think what I'm hearing is that what we need to do is make sure that as we, in that front part of the plan, we make it very clear that it will be revisited, and that we, kind of like we did with closing the gaps, that unless we meet the goals for each kind of those subgroups, we haven't necessarily reached the goal. And that's something we talked about
that's
a great deal, and it may not be clear in how it's written currently.
Yeah, I think, and what I was trying to say was that we've heard some of this, a little bit of this from the field, and I think we need to clarify the plan to make this evident. I also, on a different end, met with some people from an institution a week ago, and I do think we need to make a point up in earlier in the document that we don't want every institution to be identical, that they should address different types of students in different kinds of ways, and having a diversity in terms of the opportunities for students to go to different schools is important. I've often thought, if I were president of an institution, I'd be very proud to be president of one where everybody knew the students weren't very prepared when they came in, but everybody flocked to the campus to hire them because they were so good when they left. And so we need all these types of institutions, and the ones with the best students, there's a lot of concern nationally in terms of how much do they really add to the student versus the Pan Ams or the UH downtowns or whatever. So, I think that we need to make that clear in the language, so I appreciate
and
the comment.
I think if you, just for the standpoint of accountability and people who will take every word, I think it would be good to say that this will be implemented by a process in which you meet with each institution and et cetera. Because I think otherwise, depending on where I am on the spectrum of political things and others, I can be either really nasty about this and make it very difficult for the state to achieve this, or I can not be so. And I'm just suggesting.
Could I say something
what you say you're going to
real quick?
Do it.
And with all due respect for Steve's point of view, I'm also concerned that we not inadvertently, shorten the stick, so to speak, for students most in need of the benefits of our plan. So, let's be careful. Let's not come up with some sort of an affirmative action kind of a situation for certain institutions. And, I get a little bit queasy.
Well, that's precisely why I wanted to make the point that during Closing the Gaps, the institutions that made the biggest gains were some of the institutions with the least resources, and it's really a remarkable effort on their part. And it's not that they should have fewer resources, but I think that our improvement in the state has been many students graduating that simply were not graduating before, and so these are all balances that you have to strike going forward. And I have to say one thing that we never did with Closing the Gaps was single out institutions as doing badly. We would have conversations with them in terms of how to help, and one point to the accountability system was if people would sit there and look at their data in a group of similar institutions and somebody was doing better than the others, to discuss how did you manage to do that, to share resources. So, but these are things you have to face inevitably with every plan that you make if it's meaningful at all. And years ago, people were concerned about raising standards in high schools, and what happened was that the students performed at a higher level. And about 15 years ago or so, not only did they do that, but the dropout rate was reduced. But we still aren't where we need to be there either.
Well, I think the reality of our plan of 60% in 2030 is you can't get there unless you substantially close the gaps. And I give you El Paso as an example where we outperform in post-secondary attainment across all ethnic and racial groups, particularly in the Hispanic population, against state and national. But since we're 85% Hispanic, when you roll it all up, we're still less than competitive in our workforce in terms of post-secondary attainment. So the numbers don't work unless we actually have a closing of the gaps. And I think
that's exactly my point.
Yeah. So, but everybody's starting at different places, different ethnic groups, different institutions, and we've got to figure out how the resources go there to where they need to go to make the difference. Yes, Raymond.
Well, I just want to say, Steve, I completely agree with the point that you made. We'll make sure that the next draft of the plan refers more explicitly to the kinds of issues you're dealing with. Yours as well, Bertie. I can tell you one thing in terms of recognizing the differences among institutions. We've been dealing with the issue of performance-based funding this is the fourth session, I believe, and if one thing has been made abundantly clear to us by the institutions, by members of the legislature, it's been virtually tattooed on our brains, is that one size doesn't fit all. So we know that we're going to have to come up with strategies that vary institution by institution, and we'll make that more explicit.
Also, if we could revisit the language in closing the gaps on excellence, I think their institutions were challenged to develop fields of study or degrees where they could compete regionally or nationally, but they weren't mandated by coursework by the plan, but it was a collaboration and it was introspection and then a decision and a way to measure that. And so maybe some of that language that talks about that process would be relative in this plan.
Good point.
Woody, I have another big picture thing to lay out on the table, and it leads from the important goals of the state by 2030. When I went through the document in here, I guess just my normal thing in here, what comes first seems to be the most important, and then it kind of dwindles down. And I'm not suggesting that we take all of these goals and strategies and so on and try to rank them things. But I would challenge the staff to, as this thing goes forward, is to make sure that the most important goals that we think are really important get up there at the top of the page and so on, because I think it's just a normal reaction is that, wow, that's pretty important because it's the first thing I read. I tried to take my pencil and put arrows around in here, and I didn't get very far. But on the other hand, I trust that this group over here can help us out on that. But I would like to see, as we put the document together, that the most important issues really do float to the top.
And I don't know whether anybody's had a chance to look at some of the comments because they were just in your package this morning, but I think we need to ask ourselves, how much do we try to respond or explain? I mean, there's one comment in here on research. We don't talk about research. Well, the reason we don't talk about research is kind of a conclusion that a competitive workforce and the income that comes from it is kind of the support that ultimately a state, a political unit needs to be able to fund research. So if we lose the competitiveness of our workforce, we don't have any good examples in either countries or states that have robust research programs in a poor performing economy. So whether we try to answer that, another comment in here was, well, you're too focused on the workforce. We need to have educated citizens and everything that goes with that. But once again, the argument is in a low-performing economy where everybody's struggling to make ends meet, you don't have the support for the arts, cultural, and everything else that adds up to high quality of life. So I don't know whether we need some kind of an explanation on why we are, and it's not that don't think other things are important, but it's kind of like what Bob said. We think this is the most important thing, is that for everything else to happen, we need a competitive workforce.
Well, that's right. And part of, at least the way we develop strategic plans, is you focus on those things that people in institutions wouldn't necessarily focus on if not for the plan. So we know that there's a huge movement in terms of increasing research. I don't think we have to encourage anyone to do that. But I think, they'd like a document to say, well, see, the plan says you have to do that. Well, that's happening. The legislature, is talking about research funds again this time. What really makes the difference overall? And another comment in terms of research, Norm Hackerman, which I hope at least a few of you knew, an amazing man, former president of Rice and University of Texas at Austin, a great chemist, Van Diver Bush Award winner, told me years ago that the most important economic driver in his view were undergraduates who had some research experience, while undergraduates who went directly into the workforce. And that, from an economic driver, was more important than much of what you do at the graduate level, though he, of course, endorsed that. But he said, all the undergraduate education, his view, was critical. And I think we've found that to be true. And he even used that as, when we had much more money for the Advanced Technology Advanced Research Program, when we had $60 million. And defending that was that those grants included a requirement that undergraduates be involved in the research in the labs, because most of them would not be going to graduate school. Most of them would be working for, whether it's TI or Schlumberger or someone else. And so the challenge is not to include everything everybody thinks is important, because then you have nothing. You know, I've seen accountability systems that have 100 goals. Well, what's your focus? And so the key is, you have what's important here, and we're not going to have everything that everyone wants. There's an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed about, I've forgotten the name of the group, but it's getting some notoriety because of, he's a Yale graduate who's helping people with some additional tech coding skills when they leave in a very focused kind of way. And the discussion in that article is how it's almost the same discussion. Well, what about the arts and whatever? And the point is that we need to pay more attention to getting people jobs, even though I'm a firm believer that the arts are important and literature is important, and I think you're better in the workforce if you've got some background in that. But if you can't get a job, it doesn't matter. And we should be concerned about helping those students contribute to the society, and they do that, then they can also contribute to the arts and support the symphony or Bob Dylan or whoever they want to support. So that's the challenge, is not to be straight off by all these things. I know Woody understands this. And you can't have the resources for the institutions, some of them that really don't have the resources they need, if you don't have a thriving economy. These things all tie in together.
Yes, Lori.
Speaking of the research and excellence portion of Closing the Gaps, it seems to me, and I may be overreaching, but it seems to me that having that in place in the original Closing the Gaps document was pretty much the force behind the emerging institutions that became part of the Tier 1 potential. In fact, that drove Texas Tech and U of H to that status. So I'm wondering if there's anything that should be in the document to continue that momentum. I don't want to see that dropped. I know how important it is to you, Commissioner, that about, I embedded in my mind about, how our institutions compared to like a Stanford, and so you get, the Rice, the UT, the U of H, the Texas Tech, and then what about the other emerging ones? Is there something that we could or should have contained as in this document as we move forward for the next 15 years?
Well, in the statement, if we add a statement early on about having a range of types of institutions, one could mention the importance of that. But I do believe that momentum is there, and I don't think there's any need to add something directly to say, well, we need have a goal or strategy to do that. I mean, if one were to do that, you could say you really need a strategy specifically to say we need many more resources for all the institutions Steve was talking about. Because, the reality is, if you have a student that isn't as well prepared, it does take more intense resources to really provide them the support they deserve if they enroll. But institutions are doing a better job. And so that there's just all these things that are there, and I don't personally think there's a need to. I mean, there's legislation and funds in place to do that did not exist before. So the first plan achieved that.
Yeah, Lori, we don't need to induce universities to raise a research profile. That's probably the number one priority for most universities in the state. I think the greater danger is that they will emphasize research at the expense of undergraduate education.
Yeah.
So I think our focus should remain on undergraduate education, and I think that the research agenda will take care of itself.
Yeah. I'm fine with that. I just didn't want to lose that momentum because of the other emerging research universities. I just didn't want them to think that because this document doesn't reflect it or focus on it, that we're not concerned with it and still supportive.
We could put something in the plan that suggests that we encourage more intensive research activity at the universities.
Okay.
We can do that.
Yeah.
Woody?
Yes, Lionel.
I really, just looking at everything here in terms of having it look exciting and communicating well and everything like that, I just love the way this graphic looks. It's 60 by 30. It looks forward. It's bold. It's new. It's something that is so clear, And I think that by that easy to remember thing here, I think I agree with Bob in terms of having the strategies that are most important be first and so forth. But I also think we ought to try a little bit harder to be as concise and clear as we possibly can. Like the overreaching goal here, it couldn't be more precise and more clear the way that you have it right here. And I think then when we get into the possible strategies and so forth, that we can look to some editing there to say, how many words can we get rid of so that we can make this clearer and easier to remember? For instance, on the number 1, if we said respond to the changing needs of Texas' changing population so all students are supported to and through higher education, I think that says it. Start everything with a verb. Respond to the changing needs of Texas population, to the needs of Texas changing population. And then on the other one, for example, aggressively promote college attainment to students and parents prior to high school, period. And just kind of do that exercise. How many words can I possibly get rid of? And how many sentences can I start with a verb, with an action, so that everything is as clear as it can be? I think we need to really work on that, because we're getting very, very close to having something super exciting here.
I really appreciate that. And I'd like to also put the discussion we had just before you made that comment in that same context, because we have to be careful about how many other things we add to the text, because then you can lose that direction as well. And so I think we need to be very careful about the additions and that they not be so extensive that they sidetrack the main message. So. And just yesterday, when we were going over these, I was thinking the old Strunk and White thing about excess words. And staff can tell you, I say, well, what does this word add to that strategy? I don't know. And
subtractions are sometimes more important than a lot of additions, because to your point, you get too much, you wind up doing nothing. Yeah. You get a few that everybody remembers, that everybody can get behind, and then everybody does them.
Following that up, how would you like input to come from? Because I'd like to encourage individual committee members to have direct input along the lines Lionel just laid out. I mean, when you see things, whether you want the whole report or different parts of it, who should be the point person as far as, should it be Mary or?
If you send them in through Mary, Mary will get them to all of us. Okay. We do hope today, specifically with the strategies, we can get to some of exactly what you're talking about, because we do have excess words in a lot of those strategies.
Right. Along those lines, I'm going to go ahead and move us forward. And we're talking about, here are some of the things we talked about, and we've already talked about this morning, so I'm going to go ahead. Characteristic, measurable, broad strategy, so that it gives us flexibility. We don't know what's going to happen in 15 years. We don't know where higher ed, what new things are going to come forward. So we need those strategies to be able to be broad enough so that people can say, oh, I could try this and it would still fit. And also, we want the institutions to be creative about what they're doing. We don't want them to say, well, this is what it says we're going to do, so we need to do it this. No, the people out there are very smart. They're going to be able to come up with new ideas and try new things, and that's what we want to have. We have distributed the plan we have a mailing list of different groups, and we have sent it out to everybody on our group, so thousands of people, for comment. We've had the webinars. We've done all of that. It will again go out after our June committee meeting, after the board sees it in June. It will go out again for more comment in time for the July board meeting. So, are there obvious strategies that we're missing? So that's the big thing. Are there things that we're missing? We don't feel, as a staff, we don't feel like there is the one, like, kind of, oh, this would change everything, like we did about, making the recommended high school program the default. We thought that was really good. In the research area on closing the gaps, at the time, universities only got to keep 50% of their indirect cost recovery. And so that was a recommendation that they got to keep 100% of their indirect costs. So there are things like that that really helped make a difference. Do we have anything like that that we're missing? So that's what we're going to be talking about. And as
I was hoping to say this while David was out of the room, but now that he's back in the room.
I was just over there. I'm listening.
I think I found a spot for this one that's kind of I can't let go of, and that is under the possible strategies for overarching goal, the second bullet, develop and implement education and curriculum delivery systems to make higher education available to a broader and changing population. And then the second sentence could be, engage in collaboration with K-12 institutions to align with their work in implementation of House Bill 5.
And that bullet was actually there for you.
Yeah, right.
To have it.
I asked them to take it out. That's why you wanted me to be out of the room.
So actually, that is our bullet. We wanted to make it. That goes back to we wanted to make sure it was broad enough, so that it was for example. And here's some of the things you could do, because we do have changing. We also, and you'll see in, I think it's in completion. In completion, where we talk about streamlining credential pathways. And that's where we're seeing alignment with those endorsements, the HB5 endorsements. We don't want to call them out HB5 endorsements, because as you move forward, HB5 has already changed. There's a new HB5. So that's why we're not calling it out.
It's also the case, if we do our job, we will address that in the very near term. And as I mentioned, there's a bill specifically which looks like it's done, really, and is going to happen, which we requested for programs of study, which specifically calls for us to work with the high schools on their endorsements and make a clear progress forward from those endorsements through community college programs, some of which may start there, but so that it leads directly to a certificate or an associate degree without any loss of courses. So we're not trying to eliminate it, and it's one of those things we think we could put it here, but it will be a very short-term thing that we would do, hopefully. And we want to make sure that we continue to do this in other areas. We don't know, as Susan was saying, what a legislature 5-6 years from now might do, and it may mean we have to redo that. But this particular one works on that, and part of it is, I mean, if we talk about what Lionel was saying, make these clear, but you may not have intended this, but broad enough that it gives us the flexibility to adjust and do a lot of things going forward. And we have to involve the schools.
Yeah, I think it's important that we tell them what we want, and then many times they'll figure it out how. If we're very clear on the what, the hows, I don't know how much we have to concentrate on the hows, but if we make the what it is that needs to be done, like aggressively promote college attainment. Obviously, it's to students, but maybe what isn't as clear as to parents, and prior to high school is good. But then when we say including collaboration with existing organizations to ensure consistent messaging, is that really necessary? No, I don't think so. I think they can figure that out for themselves.
Yeah. That's exactly right, I think. And And part of it, almost everything here suggests we have to work with other people to accomplish it. I mean, you know, and that's one thing we clearly, we knew from the beginning with closing the gaps, but we really learned even more how much hard on-the-ground work it takes to make sure you're talking to all the school districts. As you know, Steve was saying, that we meet with the various institutions to try to work this out, to share things as we see. We have had a case where one community college was doing something very effective, and we actually provided a little money for them to help a local university do the same thing. You don't hear about that often, but that university is better off for that community college help. But it was because we observed the difference there, and became brokers in terms of getting people together. So it's hard, and so these, again, they have to be things the committee agrees on. So if we need to specifically mention in this HB 5 in the committee, that's what the committee wants to do, we'll certainly do that.
But if you don't want to mention HB 5 specifically, you know, I would submit that this is as major of a change that is providing pretty significant obstacles and challenges to K-12 right now. And this is as significant as in 1999 when school districts started opting for the more rigorous curriculum. This is as significant. And I don't think it's going to go away with subsequent legislative sessions in such a broad or in such a specific way, but I do think that it's going to be consistent and, furthermore, even more maybe memorable to K-12 than this. That would be the only time that K-12 specifically is mentioned. And I think it would be a recognition to K-12 that this isn't all about higher ed, and that K-12 will say, gosh, they recognize this struggle that we're going to have to go through over the next 1, 2, 10, 15 years, and they're recognizing that and understanding that endorsement areas are way different than the recommended high school curriculum had subscribed to in
and this is a good discussion. So this first example, for example, I think was intending to get to the ISDs. Maybe, I mean, already I've heard the suggestion that we add the word aggressively, but is there some way that first example could be modified to make more clear what you're talking about with working with, it doesn't say ISDs, but clearly if you're talking about prior to high school, that ISDs have
maybe
to be.
Something that would say to align, let's see, increase efforts to promote college attendance. I was going to go to this. Something about to align K-12 work with implementation of endorsements or areas of study or something like that. I mean, the goal is, I think, is to look at higher ed not necessarily dictating to K-12, but it's all about what K-12 results are, you know, it's all about their goals. If they're not doing their work, higher ed can forget any lofty goals that they expect from them.
Yeah, I'd like to just interject something. I don't know how strongly I could second what Lori's saying. I mean, we don't have to call out HB 5 because at all. But the repercussions of that are significant, and I think that it would truly be a miss of this document if we did not call out something more strongly on K through 12.
Okay, can I get y'all to go down 2 slides, Ginger? And if you'll look at the bullet where it says streamline credential pathways.
P16, so whether
And
we
thank
add
you.
it, it's still got to be consistent.
And thank you for saying P16, because remember, particularly in this session, as we've had in other sessions, but more so now, the emphasis on early education and statewide pre-K. So thank you for the P16 language. We've got it right in the document. We just need to speak that same voice.
So does this answer your question? We don't want to be having strategies that overlap throughout, because we feel like each strategy really will contribute to multiple goals.
And we had felt this example addressed what you were talking about, but maybe we need to modify the language somewhat to make it more clear. And by the way,
I think this is where
continuum is one of these words I thought was probably not necessary.
And if you go up to the
continuum.
go up one slide, Ginger, please. This one also talks about building credentials at each level with the aim of reducing coursework and duplication. So we have it built in kind of in a different way to where they're building upon that. So we thought those two might have gotten to what you were talking about too.
Not really.
Not really? Okay.
No, it needs to be specifically HB5 or it doesn't get
Yeah, it's
to
all
it.
about higher ed. P16 is the whole, I'm talking about specifically K-12 and not even P-12 because that's a separate issue. K-12 has been charged specifically with a whole new set of strategies and goals. And if somehow, I agree we don't have to mention House Bill 5, and I know that House Bill 5 will change over legislative years, but that whole philosophy is a different philosophy than what we talked about when we had the recommended high school curriculum, and that was the default curriculum.
But would it be helpful if Rex would come up and talk about the legislation that's going to put into law, I think, exactly what you're talking about?
Okay.
We think this is very important, and this is legislation to the end you're talking about that was recommended by Rex's staff.
Yes.
Thank you, Rex.
Thank you. The piece of legislation that David is referring to is field of study and programs of study legislation. Fields of study deals primarily with the transfer from 2-year to 4-year schools, but programs of study really deals primarily with the issue of secondary to post-secondary. And while it has a sort of a major focus on the career and technical education arena, it also will impact and dovetail into other endorsements as well. And what we know is that the public school system has its greatest difficulty right now with trying to meet the idea of every one of them has to have at least one career and technical education endorsement. And so, part of this is not only to bring the curriculum in alignment between secondary and post-secondary schools, but there's also another piece of legislation that makes the ISDs available for what are called DRET grant funds, for example, if they have a partnership with the community college. So there are also ways to help create that collaboration and build on the collaboration between the two. So we do have this piece of legislation out there that will at least in part address the issues that you're raising and about trying to create a better alignment between the secondary and post-secondary world.
So why can't we say something in this document about it?
What if we said something like one of the necessary characteristics of the plan has to be that we stay in alignment with the current K through 12 policy, whatever happens to HB5, and just say that this plan can only succeed if we stay in alignment with the K through 12 goals and K through 12 policies and requirements. We can finesse that, but
that's fine. But
does that become text or does it become a strategy? How do you, if it's a strategy, how do you get that into the format Lionel was talking about? That's about 4 sentences.
Well, it's not a strategy.
Well, that's the point I'm trying to get at.
Well, I think it should be a strategy. I think it's important to reach out to K-12, especially now. If it had been before House Bill 5, I wouldn't be saying this, but they are struggling. The superintendents, the board members, the communities are struggling with how that's going to look. How they're not going to resegregate, and I don't mean racially, I mean socioeconomically, resegregate our society into those that are going to 4-year versus 2, certification versus, more, more specific in terms of profession versus occupation. They're struggling with that, and I think that we need to have a statement of some sort. It doesn't have to say House Bill 5, but I think we need to make a statement that the support and collaboration with K-12 as they move, forward with their policies and if you don't want to say endorsements, that's fine too. But however we say it, that it needs to be said not just in a P16 global alignment, but in a support and collaboration.
Couldn't you do that in your executive summary? Typically, when you get a document and any reader gets a document, they're going to look for the down and dirty, which is typically your executive summary. It's usually pretty concise. And then, like, the introduction's nice, but they may get lost in some of that with the graphics. And I think another significant thing is the fact the staff reviews this every 5 years. I've double checked and I don't see where we put that in the document. I don't think the general public knows that you go through the data every 5 years and you update and revise as needed. I don't think the public knows that. Do you? It's just a thought. But to me, if you want to pack a couple of powerful statements, your executive summary or your introduction, but not without adding another strategy to keep it short and sweet.
Right, back to Lionel's keep it short and sweet, but are we simply saying our efforts assume post-secondary readiness, right? Is that what we're trying to say? Or if they're not, if our pipeline is not ready for this, then it's not going to work. I don't know. Is that what we're trying to say?
Lori, I think that's your point, right?
Yeah.
That's the crux of the discussion.
Well, I think that
because all these experiments in HB5, I mean, how do we know that the pipeline is going to match up with what we're trying to do?
This is the great uncertainty right now, and I think part of what Lori is trying to get at with HB5 is that even before the recommended high school program became the default curriculum, we had the data to look at when people completed that program, what was their success and what happened to them later versus not. With the new endorsements, we don't have any information in terms of how that's going forward. And the reality is we'll know more, it'll probably take 5 years to really know what's happening with students based upon the endorsements. Because that'll be, I think, the first time you have students who've really gone through the whole program. And so I think it's absolutely true that we need to be engaged and be working with them to see what happens, but there's still a limited amount of role the higher ed has in terms of what actually happens in the public schools. But you can work with them as we did with TEA before and continue to, but there are a lot of other factors, and if we can do so much that we lose sight of the higher ed end of it, but we can't lose sight of this as well. But the balance needs to be on what we have direct planning responsibility for, which is higher ed. But for higher ed to be, it's one of these cyclical things. But
I think Laurie as she was talking, had a key word there: reach out to K-12. And if it would start at something like reach out to K-12 and then take Bernie's thing to collaborate in improving college readiness or something along that nature, reach out to K-12 to collaborate in improving college readiness, maybe something like that might encompass.
Ginger is over here trying to respond to some of the things you're saying by typing it on the screen so you can.
Responded to all those strangers.
She didn't have to type. We had to find somebody who could understand what was going on and could type as well.
Lori, so we can move on. I think we know what you want us to do, and we'll make sure that it's embedded in the text.
Well, what about this text? I mean, if we've got something written right now, we've got something you can actually respond to.
Yeah,
I think vinyl.
Okay, so what was your suggestion?
Suggestion is reach out to K-12 to collaborate in improving college readiness.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's got to be college/work readiness.
College career readiness.
Yeah, career. Sorry, thank you. It's okay.
Yeah.
And make it P16.
Does that work?
Yeah, that'll work.
This is exactly the type of work you guys are so good at. Thank you. Thanks, Lori. Thanks for bringing it up.
Can we go back to the first slide on possible strategies? Yeah, right there. In the last bullet point there, we talk about the Texas Workforce Commission, and I guess I have a sense, I'm really looking for Raymond to respond here, that there's a regionalism of our education taking place at some greater or slower speeds in different regions of the state, but you've got both political and business leadership in those regions connecting the dots between workforce competitiveness and education at post-secondary attainment. And so you've got an increasing engagement. I mean, maybe Houston might be the greater Houston area might be the leading example of engaging from a more of a bottoms-up approach than a state tops-down approach. So, and I know you and the commissioner, TA commissioner, and workforce commissioner have done your trips around to engage with. So I mean, do we need to expand this when we talk about collaboration? And maybe it's not just the workforce commission. It's the various economic development that have been entities that have been created around the state, and once again, different levels of engagement at this point. But I think competition is going to drive them toward a common goal, because not only do they compete with each other, they compete with other places around the world. So is the collaboration bullet point here need to be broadened a little bit to include those? And the whole concept of regionalization, is it valid enough that we need to give it some greater level of recognition?
Okay. Let me add one thing quickly. Later on, there is a strategy that does that.
Okay.
This one was specifically because of some concerns about whether we identify critical fields or not.
Right. Which is more of a technical.
Number. Right. So if you'll go forward, Ginger.
To the marketable skills.
To the marketable skills. We were intending to do that with Covina's, and we think we shouldn't call it an advisory group, but Covina's statewide group to explore general characteristics of marketable skills. By meta, we may not be that, but that it should include representatives from institutions, industry, and other relevant stakeholders. So we were trying to get something there to do exactly what you're saying, more broad-based than the Workforce Commission, to get together annually.
Because our school systems, our K through 12 system, as everybody knows, are thousands of school districts, and there's thousands of schools and school districts that have their own political elected leaders. And I mean, that's part of this, at least I see this process of regionalism that are engaging. I mean, Dallas may be a leading example there with their efforts around their school system, identifying their outcomes and engaging on a political basis to.
And that's the second bullet down there.
The second bullet, we see both things. We need something statewide that probably just meets once a year. Then we've got the regional collaborations among institutions, the local employers, and of course,
probably
most community colleges have that in
Ginger.
place, but universities don't always participate in that. So
right. And maybe adding regional economic development efforts or entities.
Sure.
Houston Partnership being probably the leading example there.
So we're in line. I just wanted to point out that it was just in a different point, and that other was added specifically. Some people had asked Raymond why we didn't have any critical fields identified, and actually specifically STEM fields have come up. We think people are very aware of STEM fields, but there's some doubt now about whether we have enough.
There was a comment I wanted to make. When I read this, I thought I'd sent some feedback in regarding STEM, but it didn't make it in here. And I think that's again, maybe very selfish, but that's a real miss as well.
Yeah.
And that's why we put in the information about the critical fields, because as the plan evolves, that needs to be continuously looked at.
And some of those things change. So, for example, STEM in general you have certain specific things you want in terms of STEM. And so we want to be able to go in so we can be more focused in terms of that. STEM generally refers, for example, STEM includes the biological sciences. We have absolutely no shortage of biological sciences.
But we have a shortage of engineers.
That's right. Well, yeah, we do, but in certain areas of engineering too, not all areas of engineering. We've done a lot of analysis on that. And so, but the intent of this is to make sure that we keep it up to date. And it's not, we don't say, okay, this is it now, but what is it in 5 years from now, to make sure you're really focusing in on the right fields going forward.
I understand.
Yeah. So we agree. We agree. But we think we get at it with that.
When I read it, I don't get at it. So that's my input. The other thing on item B, the institutions, are we talking about just higher ed institutions or secondary as well? Might be another way to call out collaboration between or among higher ed and secondary, high schools.
I'm sorry. Are you over with
we're in marketable skills? I'm sorry. I can wait and give the input later.
No, that's fine.
Under sub.
No, and that may be something that we need to talk about because this is meant to be broader because we go back to the endorsements, it's going to have to be everybody working together. So maybe we do need to broaden that a little bit.
Yeah, I think
it'd be another opportunity to bring in that collaboration because that's work has already started in Dallas. I mean, I get pulled into meetings where we've got some local universities and high schools, and we're trying to figure out they want to understand marketable skills, and it's all about, quite frankly, STEM. Typically, that's what we're talking about. And that's why when I read this document, I'm like, there's work going on in Dallas relative to this, and if I were to read this out in one of those audiences, it would say it's a miss. I don't see STEM, I don't see engineering, and this is not a TI just going in and saying, hey, you got to be talking about engineering. It's high school superintendent or superintendents and principals and university professors saying, hey, we need to be focused on this a little bit more. So, and I just think this section needs some work.
I don't see Raymond leaning forward, so I'll say what he typically will say in regards to engineering. Every school wants to have. We have more engineering programs, institutions with engineering programs than any other state. The problem is, and this comes back potentially to the HB5, we don't have the students to go into engineering with the right kind of background. And so we really do need to work with the public schools because right now, and in fact, I heard we had an email from someone trying to get us to encourage the public schools to eliminate algebra. That most people won't take algebra, so that means they won't even discover whether they're.
I know.
They're good at that.
That's why I think. That's why I think Lori's feedback is so very, very important. And somehow we need to strengthen this document that where it really pulls forward that there's got to be that collaboration with K through 12.
That also respects the chambers of commerce. Like I had mentioned to this group earlier. The Greater Houston Partnership has this entire regional program called Upskill Houston, and it mirrors everything that we're talking about. And that would add credibility and recognition to the chambers of commerce as well.
And I do want to point out that earlier, maybe 6 or 7 meetings ago, staff did bring up the possibility whether you wanted to identify critical fields. And at that time, the consensus was no. And we added this one in at the last minute just because we thought you might want to do something without identifying the specific fields. But if there is everyone, again, in terms of what do people know, people say we need more engineers. All the institutions are trying to increase engineers. A&M says they're going to double the number of engineers they produce. I assume the commissioner still wonders where we're going to get the students to go into the engineering programs. And I think part of what's going on now is we have at least 15 public institutions that offer more than one engineering program, and we have more that offer at least one. As one institution expands, if A&M doubles, I personally wonder what's going to happen to programs at some of the other institutions. I think that could potentially would make it potentially more difficult for some tech to recruit some of the students they typically have. Houston to do the same thing, perhaps UT Dallas. So these are all things that we have to work on, and to what extent you'd almost have to have an entire section on engineering. So.
Steve, in your example in Dallas, who's the driving force of those efforts of the K through 12, the colleges to?
I actually see it coming from K through 12, some of the local high schools. They're driving it. House Bill 5, all of that.
So
everything
HB 5 is the initiator of those efforts.
Yeah, because they recognize that you can't go to apply for if you do want to go into engineering or whatever it might be, biology, a major. You've got to have some basics, and a lot of these students coming out don't. And then there's those individuals those kids that they don't want that path. Not everyone goes to a 4-year institution. So they're trying to figure out, well, you don't want those kids to fall through the cracks. So what other marketable skills would a company like TI or AT&T or whatever the company is, a big employer in Dallas, what other marketable skills do we need? And so they're trying to wrap their heads around and their programs around how can we best prepare these students. And they need the UT Dallas universities like an SMU to come to the table and say, okay, how can we help? But it's not the higher ed institutions driving it. It's really K through 12. At least that's what's happening in Dallas. The things that I have personally been involved in and my team has been involved in. And as it relates to engineering, that is gone. As it relates to engineering, just yesterday I spent probably 3 hours of my day talking specifically about engineering and the graphic that we're trying to come up with to help the whole K through 12, some of the educators that are all through that continuum. They want to understand, okay, if you're designing a circuit coming out of college, your senior design project, back up all the way through, and we went up to 6th grade. Back to 6th grade, what do they need to be able to do? Not what classes they have to go to, but what do they need to be able to do? And so we're trying to put that, what hands-on experience do they need? Because it's more than just what you have in your head. It's how do you translate that into a design of whatever it is you're designing, and the whole idea of robotics and potentially having robotics as a core piece of curriculum. So that's the discussion that's happening with these folks. And it's like, well, how can a document like this or a strategy like this help give those efforts that are happening a real boost? That it's already happening. I think we could, through this document and the strategies, really help move it along faster.
But you know something, Steve? What they need to know, that's okay. What they need to know, what they need to do is in the hand, politically speaking, seems to be in the hands of people who don't know jack. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I mean, I'm very concerned about K-12, but it's not our mission, and we just have to sit here and, I mean, it's ugly out there in K-12 land.
You're right, absolutely. But I do see, to answer Woody's question, it's not what I'm seeing, at least. It's not being driven by higher ed. It's being driven by educators in K through 12 saying we want our students to be able to go to an SMU, to go to UT Dallas, to go, and how can we best prepare them? But ultimately, the goal is not just to get them into college, it's to get them a good job in a good career path if they're going down a career path. Now we can't solve all of that, but to Lori's point about how can we make at least this document very supportive of those efforts, and that the only way that this can really be successful is that is working really, really well. That's the point. I don't know if we're agreeing or disagreeing. It's hard to tell at this point.
Maybe I'm missing. You're a member of a group who is trying to influence the educators in K-12 to what? Adjust curricula to match the future, the jobs that you'll have available in the future?
We're not trying to influence K through 12. They're asking us. They're asking employers
And they're at the table. They're at the table.
They're at the table.
Yeah.
Are they going to have?
Our ISD, Richardson Independent School District, called us and said, hey, called us, meaning TI, can you have an executive come and be at the table to talk with our educators? Okay. So in that particular district, I went. And it wasn't just me. It was a room as big as this, round tables all full. And we broke off into groups saying, okay, let's talk about different marketable skills, engineering being one of them. And let's talk about what does a company like AT&T, what does a company like TI need? Raytheon, you name the companies, because most of them are represented.
But Steve, you and I are going to have to share. We're going to have to share with the team here that the Richardson ISD, in particular, the one that you're talking about, has one of the highest Asian student cohorts across the state, right? So what works there might not, they're going to have interest. They're going to want to work with you because that's what they tend to be all about, STEM.
But that's just one district, Bernie.
Okay.
DISD is the district we work most heavily with, and the southern sector of Dallas. So, we're going to debate this.
Yeah, that's okay.
The issue is, it's just that we can't just, and I don't think we're doing this. It can't be higher ed in a vacuum. It just cannot be.
Yes, but do we have any? Are we empowered to what can we do? They're in a strong grip of a political movement that says, STEM ain't that important, or something. I don't know what it is, but
I know.
You know what I mean?
I recognize that as well. I think the only thing that we can do, and maybe we're already going down that path, is to strengthen this document such that at every possible, in all these strategies, to just bring up that you've got to be aligned, you've got to be at the table, to use Lori's term, with your K through 12 counterparts. Otherwise, this is not going to work.
I will.
Okay, Susan, let's.
Okay, and I was going to mention very quickly, there is HB 2550 from last session, from the 83rd session, that does have for those institutions that have or high schools that have ISD, high schools that have very low college sending rates, it requires that community colleges and universities work with them to help them and work with them in collaboration to strengthen their programs. So that is in place. We're starting to collect some data on that and that kind of thing. So this is just a FYI. Okay, sorry.
Raymond's wanting to say something.
Well, I was going to say to Bernie that one thing higher education can do, which is absolutely critical to the success of K through 12, is we can train teachers better than we do, and we can also expand professional development for teachers. There have been a number of books that have been published in the past couple of years, for example, that point out the teacher training programs do not contain much information about the latest research in cognitive development, which is absolutely essential to teachers being effective in the classroom. So there is an opportunity there. I think I've said before this group that we've talked about research universities and so forth, and those of you that know higher education well know that there's an inverse relationship between the prestige of a research university and its interest in training teachers. The more prestigious the university, the less likely it is to train very many teachers. As I've said before, it's not the Stanfords and the Michigans and the Berkeleys and the Rices or the UT Austins that train the bulk of teachers. It's regional universities, it's Texas states that train the bulk of teachers, and those aren't our best students, by and large. And we need to attract more of our better students into the teaching profession.
Okay. So Now we'll go back to, since we've been skipping around, I do want to point out you have this document, and I think most of you have seen it, that shows all of the strategies so that you can kind of see where we have it in one area and maybe that sort of thing. So that's just and I'm going to we'll let Julie go ahead.
Okay, I'll walk you through the completion strategies. And as you can see, we have 3 slides that are going to address completion. And the completion strategies have been organized under 3 broad governing strategies. The first has to do with access to higher education. I will point out that you'll see K-12 is important throughout. But the first has to do with access to higher education. The second is focused on students' academic preparation and academic support, both as they prepare for higher education and as they move through higher education. And the third is about academic and support structures in higher education that help students complete. So that one, for example, would be about content delivery rather than about the content itself. There is some overlap in these strategies that fall under the broad strategies. For example, you'll see the strategy on the screen here that you all developed about increasing the number of economically disadvantaged high school students who take dual credit. That speaks to access to higher education. That also speaks to academic preparation. And that also speaks to affordability, because a lot of students who complete those dual credit courses are able to get through a degree more quickly and don't incur as many costs. So you'll see that as we move through. The one we're looking at now, again, is about access. It looks at guiding students to higher education in addition to the dual credit that I mentioned. And we talked about the building credentials. And, of course, we added the reaching out to K-12. And the next one, as I said, has to do with the academic preparation and academic support. And we thought it was important to include these together, how the academics are such a critical part of student success. And so we specifically have the strategy for academic preparation that's an example, streamlining credential pathways that we talked about earlier, and the importance of supporting underprepared students. And this is the one where you would have seen the examples before about pathways to English proficiency and co-requisite models in developmental education. We didn't, I think we were trying to move along the lines to removing some of the extra words, so we don't have all the specific examples there, but those types of things would fall under that in terms of the strategies.
Quick question.
Yes, of course.
Increase the participation of economically disadvantaged high school students in dual credit and other. Who's charged with getting that done?
In terms of that, I think this is the overall target, so I think that's going to have to be something that's going to, both the institutions, the higher ed institutions, the high schools, as a state, there are things that could be done, so I think it's something that everyone could play a role in, and there's different types of specific things. You know, some institutions might have a different approach to that than others, whether it's early college, high schools, other kinds of specialized dual credit programs that they're offering for students, you know, partnering in different ways.
Dual credit presumes post-secondary readiness. So you can, for disadvantaged students, I mean, we can do all we can. I mean, we can't, I don't know if we can help with that much.
Well, some of this goes to the preparation. Student preparation is not just about, hey, when you're a senior, are you prepared for college? It's about, hey, are you getting what you need in 9th grade and in 10th grade? Are we building like from 6th grade forward so that students are developing those academic skills so that when they are near when they're in the latter years of high school, you know, we'll have more students qualify for these opportunities.
Julie, I think this is one that the committee brought up itself.
Yeah, they did.
And I think that there have been some people that believe that regardless of ability, that some students in economically disadvantaged high schools that are dominated by economically disadvantaged students don't have the same access to dual credit.
Yes.
But this was something that was generated in one of our discussion groups here, so I think, you know.
Well, where there's a participation is in early college, high school, you have a community college working directly with you. So there is an impart. And also, you know, in El Paso at EPISD, we're 90% Title I student body, 90% Title I. And we have instituted a number of early college high school. We've increased enrollment. We just put a new early college high school in a high school. Okay? And we're working that. But it's all done in conjunction with community college and or UTEP. And so from my standpoint, my observation of 2 years running the EPISD Board of Managers is that dual credit is the key for the future of those those disadvantaged. And plus the fact, and we got to find a way, this goes back to the teachers, to teach dual credit, you have to have a master's degree. To teach AP, you don't. So one of my dilemmas is how do we reward with stipends, because we're precluded for the most part of rewarding teachers on the basis of scores or other things. And so give them a proper stipend to be for their master's degree. And hopefully then you've elevated that whole process. But, going back to Lori and everybody, and it will not, what we're doing here will not succeed if K through 12 does not improve. And I told Woody on the way over here, I said, the two things I see as biggest problem with secondary ed in the state of Texas is number one, the quality and competency of the trustees that we elect, which is not anything different than what we do in the legislature. But the other part of it is they don't identify, they're not taught. Principals are responsible for identifying and coaching the talent of the teachers, identifying those who are performing or not performing. And the methodology is minimal, and they're not trained in how to identify and coach talent.
In your El Paso situation, you built it and they came. Is how you built, a better dual credit opportunity for disadvantaged kids, and all of a sudden they showed up. I don't know. I mean, that's a question.
Well, let me rephrase it. Let me ask you, are you saying, are we increasing enrollment in dual credit? And the answer is yes. Yes. The students recognize the importance of it and the need. You talk about UTEP. We also did a program, we're doing a program with UTEP to go back and identify the teachers that were close to getting a master's, who didn't, and how to accelerate that. So UTEP is involved. We've done some pre-KK work with UTEP. We're getting ready to implement this next fall, and I won't be involved with the Board of Managers anymore. Our term's up Monday. So thank you, Lord.
Really?
But in any event, that those are all things that you've got to coordinate and do it. But there's got to be a higher level of discernment with regard to how you find the best teachers and the principals that are supposed to run those respective schools. And we did start this last year in the 8th grade that you had to sign an agreement with your parents on a career path, whether it was career or college. You can change, but you got a goal at the end of the 12th grade. So everybody's doing it. Plus, we've thrown in some other things like community service, 30 hours of community service for seniors and things like that. Just trying to do the well-rounded student thing. But it's an uphill battle, and this, we will not succeed. I've said to others, we will not succeed with this 30 by 60 by 30 if we don't improve the secondary schools.
I just wanted to comment that I'm crazy about dual credit in early college, and I feel guilty that the staff's getting beaten up as a big proponent. The success that we've enjoyed in Bexar County with the initiatives in partnership with the Alamo Community College District for economically disadvantaged students has been absolutely incredible. When we talk about one of our overarching goals is student debt, and we go back to time to degree. Can you think of anything more productive than, with the right people and the right set of circumstances, really expanding this in partnerships between our community colleges, regional universities, and a lot of our public school districts? So in keeping with what the illustrious former CEO of A&M Corpus Christi said, before all this dialogue, I was actually going to say I thought we ought to move this to the top, the number one under the strategy. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I agree with you on number one.
Julie, can I ask? I should have asked this earlier, and it's just a procedure kind of question. Everything else we do is percentages, and here we say it's got to be 550,000 students, and I probably forgot where we decided that that was the magic number. But is there a reason why this isn't in some other form?
We learned with closing the gaps, the percentage didn't work very well at all, and that in fact the initial closing the gaps, and but we pointed it out, it was increased by 50%, but if you achieve the gain in participation, that would mean nobody was completing it at a higher rate at all. So there was a lot of analysis that went into this, and I can say, Kathy pointed out earlier that we do look and revise. We revise that goal. If we go forward and it looks like we can do better than 550,000, it will be recommended to our board that they increase that number. But that's the reason we found that people in the field understand 550 more. It's more pointed. They get it better than a percent increase.
So to go back to really the way you stated on this, is the very first sentence says the second goal contributes to the first. Is it not a refinement of the first? Should it not be part of the first?
Which is the first? Which first?
Well, the first goal is the 60 by 30.
Oh, no. Okay.
But that's out of state too, right?
Yeah, the first includes, and this is, we talked about this a lot earlier, is that's the state goal, and we can, in fact, it's possible that higher ed could do a great job in producing graduates, but if the state's economy goes into the tank, many of these might leave the state, and we might not achieve that state goal as a result. This is what the institutions are responsible for directly. The first goal is institutions have part of the responsibility. The whole state has some responsibility in terms of building its economy, having a place that will attract people to the state, that will help keep graduates in the state. But it would be hard to hold our institutions directly responsible for the first goal because of all these other factors that come into that. The in-migrations you mentioned at a previous meeting, and that the people who leave. Right now, if you look at, we do look at data for wages when people leave school. Well, if you look at UT Austin, we only get about a 56-57% match. Part of that's because of the people who leave the state. And so we're trying to direct this head on to the institutions, and I hope the goal is to produce this amount, and we know that some will, in fact, leave the state. And in fact, it's probably a positive for some individuals that they leave the state. They might go to work for a tech industry in Palo Alto and maybe come back in 5 years. But the first one is really statewide, and everybody in the state really has some responsibility for that. The public schools, the Workforce Commission, the state strategists who work with developing the economy and luring industry into the state. All those things are wrapped into that first goal.
Well, the assumption on the first goal is that's what we need to be to have a competitive workforce.
That's right.
Based on the best research that we find available today, and it's a pretty widely adopted goal.
From Georgetown, and
right.
In fact, when I went to that meeting at Lumina and they heard we were talking about 60 by 30, they were very excited because they're really have been pushing the 60% nationally as well, coming out of Georgetown. So again, you guys are a little bit ahead of the curve.
Right. And the 550 will ultimately is tied to the 60 based on our assumptions on population growth, and as you pointed out, in or out migration. Obviously, if those change significantly, the 550 would get more and more disconnected from the 60%. But
that's right. If we have more people leaving, we won't get to the 60 unless,
without more than 550.
Exactly, and that's why we have to monitor it as we go forward.
Yeah. Or a lower population growth, and you got 550, you could even be higher than 60%.
That's right, and it is important, and I was glad that Kathy pointed, or I think it was Kathy that pointed out that we look and review these things regularly, because initially our target for African Americans was too low because we hadn't fully taken into account the TSU enrollment had dropped by about 5,000 students. And by the time the plan was adopted, they'd recovered. So we had to adjust that target upwards to account for, that wasn't an aggressive enough goal. We had changed the 500,000 to 600 plus 30,000 and changed our research target based on the fact, the feds come out with data only every 2 years, but usually it's more like 4 years. And so by the time we adopted the plan, we'd already hit that goal. And so we had, because of the more recent data. So we do have to adjust these as we go along, but specifically we aren't going with percents because it's found that didn't communicate very well with institutions and made that change.
We have percentages every place else. Are we not communicating?
It's the goal. It's the goal. The targets are to help us measure whether we're moving forward. That's more or less like a gauge for our success, and it's also to tell us that whether we need to make adjustments, like I mentioned with the African American target, that we set it too low. That's why. I mean, maybe if it's the wrong thing, you guys need to tell us. But that's why we did it. Recommended it that way.
Lionel, and then we're going to have a break for lunch.
Okay, Julie, just in the for the sake of being consistent and also short,
yes.
Might we consider the goal to be by 2030 at least 550 students in that year will have a post-secondary or will have a post-secondary credential or degree?
Well, the reason we wouldn't do that is we'd have to change the number, because then we would be including doctoral degrees. Would be including special professional. It would expand the number dramatically, or maybe not dramatically, but probably at least another 50,000. And this is what we're really targeting is these folks. And we added masters, which we didn't have last time because it's become more important to the workforce. But last time we doubled the number of doctorates without breaking a sweat, because institutions are so focused on that. This is what they're not as focused on.
We could stop it after from a Texas institution and then drop all the public independent.
I think so. I think we can shorten that quite a bit. And also on the first possible strategy, maybe start with ensure all students have the opportunity to access. I'm not sure that we, again, I think as we look through this, we might want to just see ways of getting rid of words that we don't really crucially need.
Thank you.
Okay, let's break for lunch, and we'll come back and restart within 15 minutes. Susan, are you ready?
I think we're ready. Okay. I'm going to move. Now, see if we can get this to advance. First, it was advancing on its own. Now it's there we go. So I feel like we had a good discussion. We talked about the first overarching completion-related strategy and the affiliated strategy examples. Why don't we move, if everyone's all right, we'll move to looking at the academic support and academic preparation for students moving to and through higher education. Let's see if this will work for me now. I think Ginger has to do it because she's editing for us as we go along. Oh, Nope, there it goes. So this is improving the academic support. It talks about academic preparation, which we discussed, the credentialed pathways, which we discussed, and that support for the underprepared students. And I believe I walked you through this. So if there aren't any comments, and there were several examples I gave you for the third bullet, like the co-requisite courses. So let's move to the last one.
I have a quick,
sure.
a quick comment. On number 2, improving academic preparation, the first bullet, scale up and share practices that support, I was glancing at the national organizations and others that had responded, and I think it might be helpful somehow to indicate wherever they had made comments where these comments were listened to or whatever. For example, a board member from the College for All Texans board said something about to put into place support systems. And so it seems to me, if I were one of these external people that have written in, that there would be some way of saying, here are the comments we got and here's where they are.
Yes, no, that's an excellent idea. And I think as we get more and more comments, we'll be looking at them and looking at where do they fit. So maybe we can do that in a more formal way, just so we can say, hey, here's where these pieces fit, and see if there's things that we've missed that we want to bring to you at the next meeting. And
particular case, that was already in the plan. It wasn't a change in response.
Yeah. This was one that.
I saw that too, but I thought, gosh, if I were that person, and then I see that it's already in there, that would make me feel good. Okay, good.
Okay.
Not that we're going to be able to get everybody's comments, but hopefully we can draw some conclusions.
Right, exactly.
Once you get enough scale, divide them into categories, and begin to see are there some points there that are supported enough in the comments that we need to be at this level considering them.
You're absolutely right, and that's our intention when we get the rest of those responses. Ginger, and the next one, and this has to do with the structuring the programs and support services. These were our discussions about content delivery. We had examples like competency-based education there. The high-impact practices, we could keep that very short, which I know Mr. Sosa would appreciate. But what we did add was a definition. We thought maybe that would be helpful because not everyone is familiar with that, with the terminology high-impact practices, which you all thought were so important. But certainly if we don't have it here, we'll have it somewhere in the plan. And then we included the use of predictive analytics, which was, of course, a strategy that you all recommended. And so that would tie into when the students are in higher education, what kinds of practices support their movement through the system and their completion. Are there any comments on these particular strategies?
Julie, this is the area that triggered my original comment about priorities.
Okay.
It seemed to me that when I read through this, it said structure programs, support services, the responsive changing needs of the student population. Remember, it stopped right there. I thought back about Dr. Murdoch's original presentation to us on the dynamics and the characteristics of the student bodies and the students and demographics of the state of Texas for the next 15 years. And as I recall it, that when you looked at the students or the population age less than 18, that the growth was all in Hispanic students. That the Anglo population went down a little bit. The African American was pretty constant in percentages and impact, but a very, very sharp increase in the Hispanic students. The other element of Dr. Murdoch's, and he's coming in, he can defend himself, that he had in those data was the fact that if you looked at the current household income for the various categories of the population in here, there's about a $21,000 differential between the household income between the Anglo population and the Hispanic as it currently exists. This tells me that these youngsters in here are coming from a economically disadvantaged environment, and I think that's just reality, the way it is. So And the other thing that I kind of recall is about 40% of the current Hispanic population has less than a high school education, whereas in the Anglo population, I think it was in the range around 9. So here's these kids coming down. We're talking about them here, changing needs of the student population in here. They're going to be economically disadvantaged. They're going to be first-generation college students if they get that far. And as a consequence, it seems to me that this is the key right here, is to structure some programs and services that fit the needs of this new population. I mean, to me, that just jumps right up at the top. And then when I started looking at the under 1B, it says increased participation of economically disadvantaged students and things. It seems to me that's, again, fits right into this idea. And I realize how you put it together, and I think it is logical. But I think what we're missing in here is that dynamic of getting those disadvantaged students that are going to be the new ones. If we're going to get our 550 in here, we've got to address those kids. And somehow that has to really rise up in the document to be a forceful type of thing that says, if we do nothing else, that's what we have to do if we're going to get to our 550.
Right. Well, and I think, which I was attended on, and which we'll talk about before we finish today, is the challenge. That challenge that you just laid out, Bob, are our resources consistent with meeting that challenge?
Yeah.
And it's to the extent that we believe or conclude that they're not, what recommendations are we prepared to make as far as resource allocations, investment, incrementally new investment to meet a different challenge or an increased challenge? So, but I'd plan on talking about that as we got to the end of the meeting today, so we could finish the staff.
Good, because I think from my perspective, that's a key to making this plan work.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for that comment. And I did want to point out that actually that was number 8 in the plan. You'll see on completion that's the last one, and I think it was elevated now to be an overarching, because I think people felt like that was important. And you're telling us, and I think we hear you, that we should definitely have that as a critical focus. So thank you. Anything else? Okay. Well, then I think we're going to hand it over to Rex Peebles next, who's going to be talking about marketable skills. Since we've got Ginger busy with us, busy doing our job.
Thank you. You'll notice that we have 2 possible strategies with several examples underneath. And of course, one is the one that we've talked about over and over again, and that is to simply identify marketable skills in every higher education program. The first bullet under that talks about convening a statewide advisory group, and as David alluded to earlier, it may be that we don't want to call this an advisory group. It's really more of a sort of an intentional, or it's intentionally designed to bring people together from both higher education, but business and industry as well, to actually talk about what those marketable skills might be. And to have some kind of statewide conversation about what those are and what they should be. And the second bullet then gets it at a more local or regional level about the collaboration that needs to exist between both business and industry, but higher education. And as we've heard earlier, then and probably also both secondary and post-secondary education, to really look at these things and talk about what is it they want students to be able to do and to know, and what kind of skills are we already embedding in the programs that we have and in the offerings that institutions have. And then, of course, the last bullet on the first one there talks about leveraging the existing efforts that exist to address marketable skills already. And, the state of Texas, in revising its core curriculum in the last few years that went into effect this past fall, has identified 6 core objectives, and 4 of those are often traditionally thought of as marketable skills in terms of communications, critical thinking, teamwork, but also empirical and quantitative skills as well. So we have a good start, and then how do you leverage those kinds of existing efforts that exist at institutions and at the state level to identify and, most importantly, as ensconced in that second possible strategy, is how do we then communicate those to make sure that students and their parents or guardians, but most importantly, that students and folks in the workplace know what those marketable skills are that they have when they exit the institutions. And then how do you present those and communicate those well to the workforce? So under that one, then we talk about increasing that quality of information, and whether that may be in terms of some kind of checklist or a certificate or transcripts or whatever it might be, so that students, when they leave the institution, they know what those things are and they can communicate those adequately to their prospective employers as well.
I have a question on that. In terms of the information that is needed from this statewide advisory group, we did receive several presentations of what marketable skills were, presentation skills, strategic thinking, that kind of thing. Is there still a lack of general information? Because it seemed like we got a lot of that information that we really need to convene a group like that and have it go for another several months and so forth. And would their findings be that much different regarding what has been already discovered nationwide?
Well, I think there are two reasons for this. I think it would be helpful in terms of the sort of the buy-in from institutions in particular in seeing and understanding, and even though some institutions are already working on this, but it would certainly help other institutions, I think, to understand how important this is if they also become involved in that conversation. And I think the other piece of it is that marketable skills, as they have been defined by a lot of folks so far, tend to focus on what we think of as soft skills. Communications, as you mentioned, communications and critical thinking, how do you play well together in terms of teamwork and that kind of thing, and problem solving in general terms. And I think it would be helpful to both students and to industry if there was also some conversation about more specific skills that we oftentimes refer to as hard skills, but those more specific skills that a student may graduate with. I often give people my own example of, as someone who went through political science programs, I don't know that I could do it now because of the use it or lose it problem that we all run into, but at one time, after exiting those programs, it occurred to me much later that I actually had somehow built up a lot more statistical skills than I really thought I was at the time, because all of that was focused on political science and understanding voting behavior, for example. But the skills that I learned were actually widely applicable to a lot of other areas as well. And that's something that occurred to me much later. And so that's the kind of thing, and that's really more of a hard skill than a soft skill, of something that you can communicate to a student in the course of getting this degree and going through this program or this institution. This is also something that you've picked up that may not have been made explicit to you that you're exiting with those skills. So I think it would be useful in those sense to have that kind of sort of meeting or conclave to discuss those kinds of things. So, and I think that last bullet is also kind of important about ensuring marketable skills are integrated into the curriculum. We've said at the outset that we believe that a lot of these are already integrated in the curriculum. They're there, but how do we make those things explicit to both students and to the workplace? And I think as institutions, departments, faculty, staff begin to really think about these issues, they might they'll also figure out ways to expand on those things in the curriculum, make them more explicit to students, and probably ensure that they're better embedded in their curriculum as they move forward.
Okay, so we're going to turn it over to Paul now to talk about the student debt goal and the strategies under that.
Good afternoon. I think in hearing what you're saying today, and I guess over the last meetings that you've been here, affordability of higher education is critical to making this plan work. So the first strategy we have here is one that you recommended, which is fundamentally redesign higher education funding for the betterment of students. I think that you'll notice we don't have examples for that one. It leaves it fairly open, but we're envisioning that would mean that we stop looking at the funding for higher education in separate pots, but more look at it in an overall view, holistic view. Any comments? Questions? Great. The second one we have is make higher education. Oh, yes, go ahead.
I think this, of course, thinks this is a sentence that begs the next sentence. Whatever it is. And I'm not sure we know what it is. But anyway, I'm wondering if the last 4 or 5 words ought to be for the betterment of students. When we first started talking about this, it was really to consider a redesign of our higher education that would relieve cost escalation, but there are other concepts of redesign that you might have in mind too, and in the end, what we want it to be is for the betterment of the state. So I'm not sure that language is quite right there. But as I said, this sort of begs more words than we've got. And of course, one of the things we've got is we don't really have the answer. I mean, I think, and maybe we ought to say that. We don't know what the redesign ought to be, but the financial treadmill we're on right now isn't sustainable, leads nowhere, is eventually going to have to be changed. We might as well sit down and start thinking about what the redesign ought to look like. Maybe that's the kind of message that we ought to convey. But I think when we started it in this context, in this section that's relating to student debt, it was really about that we weren't going to be able to deal with the escalating cost issue without rethinking the way higher education is funded. And that ought to be part of the package.
Okay. I too had some concern about that statement, especially the word redesign. Redesign almost implies winners and losers. You know, redesign, I'll take it over here, I'll put it over here, or even what they like to do is to decrease the budgets for higher education, which has happened over the past several sessions. Well, I guess not the last ones, but has happened in the past, I guess is the best way to put it. I'm uneasy about the word redesign because it opens a door that says, oh yes, all we have to do is take it from here and put it over there. And I think most of us feel, I do at least, I shouldn't say most, I certainly feel that the amount of money going into higher education, particularly from public sources in here, has really lagged, and it's all been shifted to the students. Now, maybe that's redesign, is to relieve the students and put it back there, but I can see where other folks might view redesign in a different way that I wouldn't agree with.
If I could add in, My understanding of what was originally discussed was to develop some approach that wouldn't do what we're currently do is what you're fearful of, is that they take from here and put over there, and so that they fully take into account all the resources that are needed. So it takes into account student financial aid. And that's not a separate pot from that you maybe draw from to send money to schools through the formula or through incentive funding or something like that. Or how do we still have a system that doesn't adequately address capital funding. And I think the idea was, tell me if I'm wrong, but was that you look at all these things together, and how do you really consider these things as all critical and more or less as a unit, rather than a system that we have now that you can do exactly what you're fearful of happening, and that is what happens now and has been happening as long as I can remember, is that the legislature does see these separate pots. And so it's hard to remember this now, but 15 years ago, institutions weren't that big about creating a pot for Texas grants. Now it's integral to what they do, but the appropriations per FTE has gone down. And so the concept is to get something where it isn't just what is favored at the time, but how does it all fit together in a meaningful kind of way, and you're less likely to make bad decisions, and I don't think anyone has a notion of what it will look like. But you can't do that if you don't talk about it.
Yeah, my point is simply that we need to say more about what we mean here. And I'm not sure that I'm certain that we don't have enough.
Yes, Raymond.
Could I? Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Well, I think there's a problem with the term betterment of students. That's so vague. Betterment could mean that you're going to improve their health, that you're going to improve their moral character. I think we probably need to make it more explicit and say redesign higher education funding to promote student completion and success. I think that's really what we have in mind. I'm also...
It's actually more than that, I think, Commissioner.
Okay, well then...
I mean, that's part of it, but I think it's really all the pieces, not just focus on students graduating, but the whole structure.
Well, then we need to give some examples of that, and then I think probably fundamentally scares off a lot of people. I don't know if we're talking about adjustments, or are we talking about essentially overthrowing the whole current system of funding for higher education?
Well, I think Larry's right in terms of we do have to find a way to describe it better, because we all know, everybody in this room has been in the position where any talk of doing anything about funding that's different throws everyone into a panic. We know that. But the idea here is that at some point you have to talk about it and figure it out, and it may be, and I think one thing that came up in the discussion, you may not find the final, the perfect solution, but at least you might be able to improve even the current system, make it more inclusive and better. I mean, I've been told, I guess it's true, that Texas initiated formula funding in the 50s was the first state, and now everybody's been tweaking it for 50 years. Well, sometimes you need to think about quitting the tweaking, and is there something better to replace it? There may not be, but I thought the committee came up with a really good strategy here. Just how do we describe it better?
Are we trying to reward on-time completers with a cap on their debt burden? I don't know, but are we trying to allow them to participate in the savings that the taxpayers get for on-time completion?
And I also think we're not addressing, Dr. Faulkner mentioned the escalating cost, and what do we do to stop that or slow it down?
I mean, I think this is, in some ways, maybe the biggest game changer if we were to achieve it in the entire plan in terms of a strategy, because if it really does take into account all these factors that different people have talked about and have at least develop a system for funding that's better now, that keeps up with the challenge. And Woody's talking about how do we have funding that keeps up with the challenge that the state is facing. All these things are really embedded in that. And
Question for you, David, or for Ray. Having looked at this a little bit over the years, one of the things that's pretty obvious is that one of the reasons the debt comes up is because students are having to support more of their education than they did previously, because the state, if you look at it in real dollar terms, has not kept up at all with inflation or anything else. So we've literally had to move the burden from the state to the individual students. And that means the kids that don't have financial resources have got to borrow more money. And so I know we don't want to raise any hackles, but at some point we might have to say that the state needs to provide more funding if it wants to improve the level of education in the state as a whole.
That's precisely.
Actually, even if we want to achieve this goal, this student debt goal,
that's what I'm talking about.
You're going to have to rethink the way it's
done. And I think the opportunity here is maybe coming from the student debt, but leading back kind of our two goals together here. Student debt at 60% and 550,000 completions from a significantly different student population. That's our challenge, and that challenge. So I think it's up to us to answer the question: are we willing to say that the state essentially is going to have any possibility of meeting the challenge and keeping the debt, that the state is going to have to invest in something greater, and we can try to look at what other states are doing. I mean, try to understand the percentage of economically disadvantaged we project to have here versus what the level of state investment should be, and we could make a recommendation. But I mean, essentially, we're getting there part of the way by setting 60%. Then we can't borrow more than 60. We want 550,000 completions. Here's our diverse population, but we aren't connecting all the dots and essentially saying all of these things can't happen unless the state invests at some higher level than they are currently.
I just was handed a suggestion trying to pull this together to you that reads, finance higher education that provides the appropriate balance among appropriations, tuition, fees, and financial aid.
Excellent.
Yes.
Or we could even get more clear, reverse the percentage of educational debt from the student to the state, or something along, because I think we do need to make the Steve's point. The state is taking less of its responsibility and shifting it to the student. So I think we have to reverse that trend in shifting the responsibility, the main responsibility, or this percentage of responsibility from the student to the state, but then come back closely with that, because I did hear several presentations of inculcating a 4-year completion mentality into the students, and that's completely gone from here. If we don't do that, that's not going to happen. So it seems to me that we might want to consider some initiative on that, exalt the benefits of early completion, of 4 to 5 year completion instead of 6 to 7 year completion. But that has to be a mentality that needs to be inculcated in I think our whole system.
But the funding has to be there, because one of the reasons the kids are doing 6 or 7 is because they can't afford things, so they're working a lot more, and as a result, they don't finish in 4 years. 4 years is much easier if I'm an upper middle class kid and mommy and daddy pay for everything.
Yeah,
but as you all know.
Yeah. I was thinking that in a stylistic, it was okay. The state will take bigger responsibility, but the student will also have a responsibility to try to finish earlier. So I think both of them working in tandem, so that they don't take it all like, oh, you just want more money again, kind of thing.
Well, how about here? Ginger has typed in this language that was suggested to me. Is that something that you could work with? Modify in some way?
I'd change appropriate to most effective.
Okay.
So that it reads most effective balance among. I think for the purposes of this goal, which is about student debt, that's a good phrasing for what we had in mind there. There are other things that you might want to achieve, as Raymond.
I like that.
I do too, and you cannot redesign without a change in appropriations. Those two just have to go hand in hand. And basically, the reason, from what I'm reading, you want to redesign the way we fund higher ed is exactly in number 2, so it's more affordable, more accessible for all students. And we've said that in other places, I know, but we're trying to open it up for everyone that desires post-secondary education.
Well, since you seem to like it, let me thank Linda Battles for handing that to me.
Thanks.
Well, it still needs to be
Have to
part
see
of a sentence.
appropriation.
It's not quite.
Yes.
It's not the.
No,
right-
we'll fix it. It's
If
the
this
idea
gets
that
at
we
it, I
wanted.
think we should combine it somehow. Thank you. Thank you, Linda.
All right, the second one, make higher education more affordable for students. And we have a few examples there, which were strategies, but now they sort of fit under this overreaching strategy. So fully fund grants, support experiments, and alternate degree pathways.
Can we say innovative approaches? Experiment sounds sounds.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need to do experiments. I'm telling you, we don't always know whether the things we're trying will work without trying them.
Yeah, and some things that, you have to try. Actually, maybe were done 40 years ago and people just quit doing them. They're not always innovative. Some of the best things are...
There are experiments that do not work.
That's right.
This is our more research institution.
Drop experiments.
Well, and actually, we talked to some staff at UT Austin about a week ago, and they were hoping that the state would be supportive of people trying some things and maybe freeing them up from certain existing restrictions that the state might have, so that they could actually try some things that they're not able to do now because of those restrictions. And it seemed to me that was a very reasonable idea.
I personally believe we need a big wave of innovation and trial. We don't really know the answers, but we need to give license to people to try some things.
Exactly. That's what they were getting at. I thought was a really good point.
Okay, next one. So our final one is build the financial literacy of Texans to promote a better understanding of how and why to pay for higher education. And then we have a couple of examples for that. Obviously, financial literacy programs, and advise students and parents on how financial aid options, on their financial aid options.
Let me say a little bit more about the last bullet. Ginger met with some of the enrollment managers from the Council of, I never remember the name, SAPUPSI. I know the acronym. And they pointed out some things that were interesting in terms of students really not even knowing how much they had in the way of loans. We just hired somebody recently who'd been the financial aid director at University of Rochester, and he pointed out that many schools have a system whereby once you get a loan, it rolls over every year without you having to do anything. And so then we got a call from TG, who had a number of institutions working, and so part of this is they've come up with a long list of ideas, and we think we need to develop some type of system to better inform students of really what they were actually paying, to tie in what they're likely to make when they graduate based on their degree plan, and work with that group to develop something that could be used statewide rather than every institution developing it separately. And frankly, if they were able to help us do a good job of that, I think that's something that would probably end up being used all over the country. But I was shocked to know that students, many, and Brookings actually had a study that came out 3 months ago that said it didn't matter what your grade points were. No student, or very few of the students actually knew what loans they had in place and how much they were going to owe when they graduated. And we need to fix that.
That's for sure.
Okay.
Any questions? So Susan or David, any more presentation from staff?
I know, but we appreciate that we all will have something to do starting tomorrow.
Yeah.
Or actually later this afternoon.
So I'd like to spend, because we've got plenty of time here, and we don't need to use it all, but I'd like to get back to Bob's point and my comments on the challenge of 550,000 completions by 2030 with student debt not exceeding 60%. And the funding that would indicate either two things: either the funding or being innovative, more productive. And on the productive side, I've seen data before, and I know Raymond and David have seen it. If you take $100,000 of tuition and state appropriations and you spend it, how many degrees do you get? And in Texas, you get, I think it's 1.8 degrees. National average is about 2. We've got a couple of states in Colorado and Florida that are one's 3 and one's 2.9. And actually, our public research universities are over there. They're like 2.2. They do better than community colleges. So not that they're obviously less expensive because they're not. It's because their graduation or completion rate is so much higher. So I guess I've had this sense that as a committee, we need to take some kind of statement on funding, that we need to fund the challenge that's represented because of the changing student demographics happening at the same time, that we need to raise the completion rate significantly. I don't know whether we can make that without also addressing the productivity issue. And so, well, here you've got it. So Texas is at 1.8 and Florida's at 2.8. So I don't know whether you have any explanation on that. And is that, I mean, obviously you go down this course, you're going to get, political leadership that say, well, we can solve all our problem. We just need to do what Florida does. So that's not my intent, but my intent is to say, if we want more money or we think greater investment is necessary, then we also have to be prepared to take the risk around being more productive as well.
So Paul can actually walk through this. He knows what's included and what's not, and there, for example, Florida doesn't include certificates. And he's recalculated these to be more up to date. So this is the first time he shared this. So
Woody, you brought this up in several meetings, and of course we couldn't resist finding out where it came from. And we found it on NCHEM's site. And so after we found it, of course, we had to try and replicate it. And we made an attempt at that. If you can go to the next slide, we pulled some data from iPads to get 2013 information, because the numbers that we're talking about are 2010, and we have more recent data. And so you can see all the states here in a kind of quick view. Texas is still is at 1.3 by this calculation, and Florida is at 2.1. There's a couple of differences, I think, between what NCHEMS did and what I did here. I replicated the number they had with just instruction and academic support expenditures, and I thought that was pretty narrow. So I included some more of the educational and general type expenses. I included institutional support, student services, scholarship expense that will typically show up on an institution's annual financial report. Like David said, I didn't see the numbers lining up when we included certificates, even though on their webpage they say credentials and degrees. When I included the certificates, the math just didn't work out any way I put it together. So you're just looking at associates and higher with this. And so one of the questions that David asked me was, well, what's the real thing that drives these numbers? What makes it really different? And a trend that you can see pretty quickly is, while the certificates are not in the numerator that doesn't count toward the degrees, they are in the cost, because there's no way to separate them out. So if a state is producing a lot of certificates, that would drive up the cost a little bit, but it wouldn't show anything in the numerator, so that would give you a lower number of awards per 100,000. You can see that Texas has a higher number of higher level degrees than Florida does. and you see that Florida has a higher number of associate's degrees than Texas does, just as a statewide. And so that's a pretty good driver on why we're seeing 1.3 degrees and they're seeing 2.1.
Larry?
Whose 100,000 is this?
This includes their expenditures. So we're not looking at where the money's coming from.
That's 100,000 spent.
Spent.
It could be public money. It could be private money.
We'll include all those sources.
As reported through IPEDS. So
Yeah.
The common denominator is it's reported to the federal government, not. So we don't have Texas generated data here other than what was reported.
Florida has a very mature and productive community college system. I think that's probably a significant part of them.
To add to that, they also, I think every community college now has one or more baccalaureate degrees that they award. Everyone, Rex, I think most of them multiple baccalaureate degrees. So that's another factor. And I'm not sure in terms of the associates, I think their transfer system may require an associate degree to guarantee the transfer in Florida. It's not in Texas, so I think that increases the number. We have a number of students in Texas who probably, this is one reason for reverse transfer, but it's also the case. Some students transfer who qualify for an associate degree, but they don't apply for it. When we first did Closing the Gaps, some community colleges went out directly and said, we're going to make sure that everyone who qualifies gets an associate degree. Others didn't, and we had a big jump in the first 2 years in associate degrees, but not every school did that. So there are a lot of...
Yeah, they do. Public and private?
It's everybody who reports to IPEDS, so yes.
So it's all higher ed expenditures in the state, no research expenditures.
No, I didn't include research. And some institutions would argue with you that those research expenditures play into the cost of a degree because they have to be in place in order to get the degree, but I just left them out for this exercise.
So you did say something that I hadn't known, and I want to make sure I heard correctly. So does the calculation include graduates from doctoral programs? And
yes.
Okay, so that's interesting. Okay.
Well, those are expensive.
And we have a higher percentage of them.
This is mainly, Woody's raised this, and we just wanted to make sure we understood what the numbers were. And best we can tell, at least all measures have strengths and weaknesses, but it appears that it's employed, I think, the same way across states. The only question for us would be, we place a heavy emphasis on certificates, and we've had a very big increase on certificates. And the unfortunate thing is they're not included, and every state seems to define what is a certificate differently. And I just learned that a couple of years ago at a meeting I went to nationally, and so there is a movement now to place more emphasis on certificates across the country. So I think one can, if you want to, you can use data. You just have to be able to say what's there and not there, and I think we understand that now.
Unless you just these numbers are virtually meaningless. If you take a university like Berkeley, where about a third of all their students are graduate students, that's going to raise the cost of a degree substantially, as opposed to an institution where only 20% of the students are graduate students.
Certainly,
so you have to disaggregate the data. Right. That the cost of a bachelor's degree, an associate's degree by state.
But certainly there'd be significant differences between institutions. I mean, it's my question between Texas and Florida, which are both large states. I think one's number 2 and the other is number 3 in terms of population in the country. So maybe there's some, and both have diverse populations, maybe with some differences. And is there any meaningful conclusion on productivity that you could draw on this comparison? I mean, you just said.
Unless you disaggregate the data, I don't think so.
I think one thing you'd want to look at is at least how many of the graduates are from community colleges versus universities, and also how many are from public versus private. I mean, those are two significant differences. And, Raymond didn't mention Stanford, but of course, it sounds like Stanford would be built into this number. But all three, California, Texas, and Florida, have significant community college populations. But I have no idea of how they break out. I know in California, interestingly enough, they probably have the highest proportion of their students are coming from community colleges, yet they have a lower number here. So as with a lot of measures, all kinds of little nuances are built into it.
So the question is, are there any good measures of state comparisons on productivity that would be useful? And the only reason I raise that really is to make the case for more funding. It would be better to also lead into that with making the case on how productive that you are with the current expenditures.
If this would work, and Susan and Julie could weigh in on this, but we have had some institutions, particularly UTEP, who have asked us to look at undergraduate enrollments versus graduates. And that's something we could do without any financial aid without any finance dollars embedded, to at least look at a productivity and for undergraduates that isn't tied directly to finance, but also isn't wedded into a 6-year graduation rate or something like that. So I don't know what that would tell us comparing these states, but that's something I think would be pretty easy to calculate.
It would be easy to calculate. The hard part, because looking across states, really the only valid source of data is iPads, and they do not break the money down by graduate and undergraduate.
Yeah, well, I was saying we wouldn't wouldn't have the finance.
Right, we wouldn't have the finance part, but looking at the per FTE or per enrollment, degrees per full-time equivalent student, something like that, we could easily do.
I mean, go ahead. I'm saying we're trying to make the case on our scheduling, how to reduce scheduled hours as a way to improve completions, lower cost. We're doing that in kind of an isolated way, in a sense of saying, here's some strategies you want to lower cost. We're not doing it in a more global, that this is how much we're spending, this is how much we think we can save. So we can drive these completions. Part of them can be driven by more productivity, but part of them are going to need to be driven by more funding. So I'm trying to get how do we make a better presentation that leads into part of the solution's productivity. We're working on that, and here's the 10 ways we think we can drive more productivity into the current expenditures, but here's the shortfall. And we think the state, to meet the challenge, has a funding challenge if it wants to accomplish it. It's not going to get there, given the student body change, without the additional investment.
Another way to look at it might be, and Raymond's pointed out from hearing at a meeting he went to, some numbers we use, and I think Complete College America may have them for multiple states, is in Texas, a 120-hour degree, it's taking about 140 to graduate. The student and the state's paying for that. For an associate degree, it's 90-plus hours and I think Raymond saw that, at least the numbers he saw, Texas no state was doing well in that, but we were doing worse.
We were doing particularly. I was at a SHIO meeting, the State Higher Education Executive Officers Organization, and there was a session and a discussion about the cost of a degree and the number of hours that students accumulate towards a particular degree. For example, among community colleges, the national average was 68 hours accumulated for a 60-hour associate's degree. In Texas, as David just pointed out, it's something like 91 or 92, incredibly out of sync with the rest of the country. And the national average for number of hours accumulated for a bachelor's degree was about 135, and in Texas, it's 140 or 141, which is an improvement over what it was 5 years ago when it was 147. So that's one way we could save an awful lot of money, not only to the state but to the students, if we could significantly decrease the number of hours accumulated towards credentials.
Beyond what's required.
Right, and it's just I don't know whether we're using the productivity recommendations in a more global sense that we need greater productivity to achieve our goal, but we also need incremental investment.
We also have numbers, just for Texas, we can tell you the massive numbers of students who accumulate many hours and never graduate. We don't have that to compare to other states, though.
Larry?
Yeah, I think these numbers, the way they're conceived, I agree with Raymond, they're actually not structured enough to be all that informative. But it seems to me, and I'd like our data gurus to tell us, but it should be possible for us to look at these data by institution type. We can get IPED's data for all the community colleges and look at productivity of associate's degrees. And we could look at all the four-year institutions. We could separate the research-intensive ones if we want to, but we could.
The ones with medical schools? And the ones with medical schools? Because that changes
Well, yeah, you can get the medical. I mean, you can definitely do. Yeah. You can do anyway. There's some fine structure you could do by looking at, and we wouldn't want to do that with every state, but maybe we'd want to do it with a couple of other benchmark states like Florida.
We can do that. You pull off
that could be worthwhile. I mean, we could. I think the comment that Raymond made about numbers of hours might show up there in that and might give us a persuasive way of arguing.
It's definitely embedded in that.
Very issues. But I think this is too gross to do the arguments right now.
On the excess hours, is there a way to determine if that's in the first couple of years in college or the last couple of years in college?
Well, it's an accumulation during the entire time. So,
but it's not.
Well, we could.
First 2 years, you really don't declare your major and all that. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out.
I would guess. I don't know that we've seen any hard data. I would guess that that most of the unnecessary hours would be accumulated the first 2 years.
Which means you got to narrow the choices so that.
Well, you've got all these general education courses.
Right.
I think, I mean, we haven't done that analysis. It's probably going to vary. I think a piece of that is, if you can make significant major changes where, if you switch from marine science to marketing, for example.
Yeah. You're going to run up a lot of courses if you do that.
I should point out, she graduated in 3 years despite switching from marine science to marketing. But yeah, I mean, that's the type of, I don't know what it would yield. Those numbers reflect, these are people who graduated after however long, and this is the number of hours they accumulated. But it would be interesting, I mean, if you really look, and when you go back to the strategy about predictive analytics, those are type of things that institutions using that have the potential to go in and identify some of these problems for students earlier. And we have a number of institutions that are already beginning to do that, I think, in significant kind of ways. And it's part of it also can be they just don't do that well the first couple of years. I think we still have a number of students who have a very hard time that first semester. Even good students sometimes will have a hard time. And so...
Of course, a formula that pays on seat time and enrollment would be one that's supportive of taking a lot of extra hours as opposed to one that's based on completion. So, I mean, even though we haven't argued in here about incentives for on completion or completion funding as opposed to enrollment funding, it's all within that same area of trying to make an argument to the institutions that a part of the solution is productivity, which they have some measure of controlling, and the trade-off there is the plan is also going to seek support for greater investment over time based on the challenge of the student population.
And I still continue to have many discussions with individuals and institutions who say, well, shouldn't the students be able to explore? And I don't think they sometimes connect that exploration may cost a student $20,000 and $20,000 in debt. And we still have a system, the core curriculum is designed for exploring, and between most majors in the core, you still have a large number of hours, a gap there but there's a cost to that. And we at least have to be aware of that. And the cost, in many cases, is debt to the student themselves.
Part of that goes along with if you're the fourth one in a household that's been to college, or your parents have been to college, you have a lot more knowledge about those kind of things. And if you're a kid that walks in
exactly
and never having anyone in your family that's been to college, and you're trying to figure out, what you do to get where you want to go, because we're not always counseling those kids the best in terms of cost effectiveness, and they're trying to figure out a system that they have no basis of experience with.
That's exactly right. And we Raymond and I both bring up that we keep hearing people talk about non-traditional students as though they just got on our doorsteps a year or two ago, and it's been a few years since I was in college, but there were a lot of non-traditional students when I was in college.
I was a non-traditional student 50 years ago.
That's right. So I mean, these are things we have to adjust to, and be aware that these students need some help. There are a lot of choices, and if you are a curious student, there are lots of attractive offerings out there in terms of taking courses, but sometimes you can take one that will still lead you in the direction you want, and you take something with slight variation that will, you can enjoy it and learn a lot, but it's not going to take you to the next step where you want to go.
A question, I was out of the room for a little while, maybe it's already been asked, but our fastest growing demographic because of means testing for the Fed money, the feds are paying a bigger share of their note than perhaps the state needs to pay. Is there some cost shifting going on there because of the low income, black, brown, demographic that's growing fast in Texas?
Well, I think the last time I looked at the data, federal financial aid accounts for at least 70% of all financial aid in Texas.
Say that again.
70. It's 70% or more. The state provides a very small portion of financial aid that Texas students receive. For example, if you look at the Texas grant program compared to all the Pell money that comes into Texas, there's a huge difference. That's one of the reasons that I go to Washington once or twice a year and meet with members of the Texas congressional delegation to tell them how important the Pell program is.
So is there some disguising of this $100,000 picture that we drew here?
That $100,000 is strictly money spent from anywhere. It's expenditures at institutions.
Okay, but not
just tuition and fees. That's total expenditures. Well, not total, but instructional and support.
But it's not state cost necessarily.
No, it's not. It's all cost.
Okay.
So it would include the financial aid.
It could be gifts. It could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So essentially, an important point, though, that is we become more economically disadvantaged, those families that have children that are going through higher education. We've got a means-tested program that's at the federal level that's essentially going to be of assistance. So there's not as much stress on the state there as the numbers might rely, as long as those programs stay in place.
As long as the Pell program remains intact, well, let me put it another way. The Pell program remaining intact And with the stipends going up at regular intervals and having the same threshold for accessibility to Pell Grants, that's absolutely essential to meeting our strategic goals.
One final question for me, Raymond, is you've made the statement several times about the importance of one family member getting through higher education, and then that's kind of a multiplier effect on other family members. Is there any scholarly work done around that? I mean, because that's another way to essentially make an argument for funding intervention, is because it's not just that student, it's really changing a whole culture over time, and you're getting multiple derivative benefits of that.
I've seen, I don't know that there's a lot of research on this issue. I've seen they're sometimes called cohort studies, how a surge in students in a particular generation going to college from underrepresented groups typically has an impact on successive generations and so forth. I saw a study recently, I think somebody on staff sent it to me, that showed that undocumented students have led to an increase in native-born students going to college in Texas, because the native-born students say, well, if this undocumented Latino student can do it, then I, as a native-born Latino, can do it as well. So I don't know how definitive or how rigorous that study was, but there are studies that do look at the issue, and there does seem to be some evidence that members of a family going to college has an impact on other members of the family likely to go.
Steve. I think there's a pretty good set of academic literature. I'm not an education person, but I've seen indications of that, and clearly it makes a lot of difference in terms of how you know to maneuver through the system and the cost for doing so, depending on whether you're the first one ever in college or the third one in a family.
There certainly is a lot of literature about parental experience on their children and their likelihood of going to college. We do know that.
And with closing the gaps, Steve made the point, you may not remember it anymore, we thought it was a good point, that once you get people into school, and initially there will be a much higher demand on financial aid because they're first generation. But as you build in this cycle where you have, this person's goes to college for the first time and their children come along, you're likely, as you go along, to have a little less demand on financial aid as you build up that structure. And that's what I think you see in some of the numbers from other countries, where they're actually to build up a stronger base of people who they become instead of continually first generation, they're getting to the point where it's second and third generation, and the first generation is a smaller percent of the population. We still have first generation as a huge part of our population in Texas, and I think we will for quite a while.
And I think the other part of that is that there's one of the things that makes the comparisons of data is and I'm not really the person that should be saying this, I guess, but the reality of it is that Latinos Hispanics are not all the same. And so when you look at them socioeconomically, for example, Cubans tend to be, in many parts of the country, a little different than non-Hispanic whites in terms of income. So, we get all these lumped together when it's really Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans that have the most financial problems. They're the poorest of that set. And that doesn't mean there aren't poor Cubans, but Cubans are, background-wise, have come, when they came from Cuba, they were not the poorest people that fled Fidel. It was middle-class people.
I thought we had the data. We don't have it, as it turns out. But I'd asked staff to look at student debt by ethnicity and gender. And we just looked at that for the first time on Friday. And one thing that stood out to us was that women had a higher percentage of women had debt than men, for example. So we're going to dedicate our next 4 Fridays to breaking down this data more and more. But with this goal, we know we're going to really need to know a lot more about this than we do. And staff raised some ideas about why that gender difference might exist, but we need to look at that more extensively.
Certainly, I mean, several themes. One is the one around dual credit that I think, to me, is prominent as possible in here because it's got many good predictors around it, one of which is just lowers the cost because of when you go to college and you've accumulated hours is a big advantage there. So I think we need to make sure we lead with that. Currently, the scheduled hour or the actual hours versus the scheduled hours is kind of should be a low-hanging fruit as far as our report and trying to meet higher levels of productivity, however we choose to measure those. And then trying to build the argument for more funding needs to be around, and I know we talk about Medicaid and correction funding in here and a better population, you'll spend less on that, but maybe we need to spend less on financial aid because for the reasons if you have a higher income and a better educated population, their children are going to need less financial aid, just like the population would need less Medicaid or less correctional expenditures. So trying to build a political case is and connecting it as well as we can is something at least I'll be looking at as we look at the next versions of our report.
Can you help us a little bit with that, Steve? Would you?
I think we can because we can look at some of the costs for not educating, because there are costs for not educating people that are state costs that go through systems of support. So if you're looking at aid for dependent children, et cetera, NADF and so forth, ADFC, AFDC, you will find that those are federal costs, but there are also state costs in other programs. So we pay whether or not we educate people, but in one case we end up subsidizing people to just basically survive, and the other one they can become productive members of our population and contribute.
In my family, I guess there's two things that might play here. One is, the rising tide floats all boats. So that's from a coaching standpoint. If dumb Granddaddy Bernie got through college, certainly you can. And then
it's tougher now.
But the adult child thing that I hear sometimes is, how can you coach your kid to go to college if you never finished? So I hear that as well. So those are two things.
This issue of calling attention to or making sure members of the legislature, people who make decisions about funding for education, have information about what it takes to educate people. They have all that information. They've always had that information. We did a study 6 or 7 years ago that Ray Perryman did that I thought was a brilliant analysis of what the benefits of meeting the goals of closing the gaps would be. And we circulated that report to all the key members of the legislature, the governor's office. I don't think it made a dent. Every university I know of, I see their annual reports. They provide information to the legislature about the return on investment. I see Jerry smiling as I talk. They know this. I think, frankly, we have to predicate whatever we propose on the assumption that levels of funding for public higher education are not going to increase on a student FTE basis. Funding for public higher education peaked in what, Larry, 1992, something like that? And it's been...
No, it was more recent than that. In Texas, you mean?
No, nationally.
Oh.
I don't know that.
And it's been going down on a student FTE basis. Appropriations have gone up in absolute dollars. I don't see any evidence anywhere in the country that states are going to fund
You're
higher
talking
education.
about state appropriations per capita?
Yes.
Yeah. Was probably something like that.
But the difference is in states is rates of growth in population. Lots of those states are actually going the other way when it comes to younger populations. What people don't realize, if you don't have a diverse set of young people, your numbers are going down for kids, because African Americans now, fertility is below replacement. And that's true for non-Hispanic whites. It's true, of course, for Asians. If you don't have Hispanics, you're not growing in terms of long-term. I mean, you can bring people in, but Florida, for example, has much less growth in those populations than we do.
Back when we started closing the gaps, Oklahoma put out a couple of years later their statewide plan, and it was to entice students from other states to come to Oklahoma for that very reason.
Yeah, and one important change that's happened in the last decade is at one time, Texas was very consistent in terms of at least increasing funding with enrollment growth at the same sort of per FTSE, but that hasn't happened in 13, 14 years now. While you could have argued whether that amount was adequate, that's a different question. But unlike many states, there were many states where they would have these huge increases in funding and just make Texas look very poorly funded in comparison. But then 5-10 years later, it would dramatically drop. So many states had this up and down funding. We at least had funding that went up as we added students, but we don't have that really now either.
So we want to add a lot more, right?
We need to.
Well, and actually, this is partially to your point, Woody. Is that vividly said in terms of Texas grant, we've really, and the legislature's put in $3.2 billion, I think, into that, but we've increased enrollments so dramatically, and so part of our success with closing the gaps has made it harder to keep up with the financial need. And I think this will be true with this as well. And somehow we need to make the point, I think you mentioned to me the other day, something like making the finances keep up with the challenge of the state. And I think that's sort of a key phrase that maybe you had suggested I think we need to use somehow.
Funding the challenge, essentially, yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, Lori.
Two thoughts. Have we made enough of an emphasis somewhere that 15 hours is a full-time student and not 12 or 9? Have we emphasized that enough somewhere? Because that would have a tremendous impact on how many at one point in time any university has in its total enrollment, as well as student debt. And I wonder if the kind of mental image in a student currently at a university is that, oh, well, I can take 9 hours or 12 hours and still graduate on time, or whatever on time means to that person. And there was a second point I was going to make about that. Oh, and philosophically, have we emphasized enough to the universities? And I'm not talking about grade inflation or false sense of, promotion or keeping these kids in college, but going back to what we said many, many years ago of the, not all of you will graduate and, by goodness, we're going to make it so tough that some of you don't. Have we changed that kind of philosophy in our universities such that they are on board with keeping these? I mean, we can talk all day long about we want all these students to stay in school, but if the universities are really trying to make it so tough for them competitively and not just making grades but staying in school, have we made that message strong enough to the universities? Because otherwise they're going to still try and kick these kids out or make it so tough and not supportive, as well as the students thinking, well, I can just take 12 hours and coast along for 5 or 6 years.
I think whether we're where we need to be is one question, but I think in my mind there's no doubt that culture has changed at the schools. Because we didn't talk about graduation rates and closing the gaps, but we've moved from a 45% 6-year graduation rate to 60%, with more students on Pell Grants, with more students first time in college. And I think that wouldn't happen without some, at least, change in awareness and culture of institutions. Are we where we need to be? No, but I think we can't ignore the fact that I think there is more consideration of that. Then it's balanced by the schools who will still say, well, we've got all these non-traditional students, so what can we do? Well, some schools are obviously figuring that out, and we need to make sure that more schools are doing it.
Well, clearly some of the successes have been pointed out with the STAR awards. I mean, we see those, but those are pockets of excellence.
But this graduation rate is statewide. We've moved from statewide. When we first started calculating that, which was before the plan, there were 3 schools in the state that were above 45%, UT, A&M, and Stephen F. Austin, actually, at the time. And now, all but maybe a handful are above that. So this has been a statewide change. I'm not trying to suggest we don't do more, but I think to get better, you have to acknowledge when people have actually done better, and we shouldn't ignore the fact that schools are doing better at this and more cognizant of it. Also, in terms of the hours, we have to remember that part of that is driven by the federal government and what they consider full-time for their money, which is 12 hours.
But Lori, there's another factor that comes in here that kind of works against that, and that's dropout rate. And the advisors that are down in the trenches there with the students in there says, well, you ought to back off a little bit on that because I'm not really sure you're quite ready to do that, so why don't you take 12 credits instead of 18 or 15 or whatever it is. And so there is that dynamic that still exists in there relative to dropout, and you can't ignore that because some of the students just feel like that's too much work, and so on. So I agree with the concept. We ought to get them up there and take the 16 or more credits and get them out in 4 years. But there is this counter element in there that says, well, we really don't want them to drop out, and if they take too much, they may just give up and hit the door.
Yeah, I hear you on that, and K-12 had the same issue, when we talked about the more rigorous curriculum. Gosh, if we make it more rigorous, more students will drop out. But they found the opposite was true. You make it more rigorous and more kids level up. Same with the STAR test, for example.
Well, with higher education, I think part of what you have going on here with the kids, with the financial, is you have a lot more kids working. Even at Rice, I'm always surprised how many kids are working. And so the days when you just went to school and that's what you did, your job was going to school, are being replaced in lots of cases by kids with a half-time job at least, sometimes more, and taking 12 or 15 hours. And so I think that is also driving the numbers down from what they were when most of us went through. Larry?
Relative to this theme here, we actually did a lot of work while I was president at UT on student load and tried to get them to take a little more. And Bob was absolutely right that actually the largest part of the battle was in the counselors. They had mentally taken hold of the idea that 12 hours was a full load. But we actually had a very interesting study done while I was there, which showed that the same set of students, not cohorts that were comparable or supposed to be comparable, the same students had higher GPAs in semesters that they took heavier loads. The heavier they took, the higher the GPA was until you hit 17 semester hours, and then it turned down a little bit.
I think that's a really interesting study because it fits with, we know that a lot of students who go to college, one of their biggest issues, even when they work, less so when they work, I think, but is all the time they sort of have on their hands and not knowing necessarily how to manage it. And when you get to a larger number of hours, some of you almost have no choice.
Better.
You get better at it because you've got the plan. And I think students taking I think the issue with working is where are you working? And I know in Houston, a lot of people that work have to drive at a large number, even at Rice, if they're going to work at a Best Buy or something, you probably have to drive.
And I will have
to
to
get there.
tell my colleague, Dr. Faulkner, that students at A&M and UT Austin are not necessarily representative of the financial structure of students in Texas.
Well, I didn't say anything about that.
I just meant that
taking lighter loads doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a better performance.
No,
In fact, it means you're going to get a worse performance.
Yeah, what I was getting at is that students taking a smaller load is more often in schools where the kids are there are poor to start out with, and so they are working more.
There's another factor too. I think is there's been a change culture over 30 or 40 years in terms of what's appropriate and what's not, and even the concept of grades. I mean, I never would have. I don't think I ever met anyone when I was in school that made a B that would take the course over to make an A or C. That people do that because the demand on grades is so much higher now. And I went to a school where virtually everyone worked, including me, and virtually everyone I knew graduated in 4 years. Now, they wouldn't want to run for president because they'd be embarrassed about their grade point. But so there is a change in culture in that sense that we have to understand and adapt to or change somehow. But students influence other students a lot, and more than we'd like to think sometimes.
We've been, in response to Lori's point, we've been moving away from the notion of 15 hours a semester, which, for example, Complete College America supported, and going to the notion of completing 30 hours a year.
There you go.
And that might mean taking 1 or 2 courses in the summer, but...
or correspondence online.
Yeah, so if you want to do 15, 12, and 3, that's fine. If you want to do 12, 12, and 6, that's also fine. Obviously, one of the ways that we could help that would be to... we talked about this the other day internally, is to restructure financial aid so that students get financial support when they go to school in the summer.
Yeah. There was also a change, and so there's some schools that are able to do some of this in Texas now if they choose to. But those of us who went to college in Texas many years ago, it costs the same whether you took 12 hours or 18 hours. Virtually everybody was making sort of an economic decision. Why would they take 12 hours when they could take at least 15 for the same price? Because they were having to work to pay for those hours. And so a lot of these things fit together. But the main thing is that it is a different environment now, and how can we make it and have some of those innovations or experiments to help people get through. Nobody wants to stay in school 10 years.
Okay, so I don't mind being really dumb. Okay, so I'm going to be really dumb. We have the common application form, okay, for our public universities. Why don't we get a bunch of young gamers and let them develop for electronic registration across the board, consistency, so that if in fact you are signing up for these courses, it pops up what degrees they're relevant to. It could be all because they're core curriculum. If at the end of your order, you see I shop online, I have no technology skills, but I can buy, okay? And I can tell you, I get really upset when there is not a live chat room, man. I am offended. But, because I want to know how long that skirt is, and it looks real short on that 5'10" model, okay? Which ain't me. But anyway, so at the end, you would sign up for 9 hours. It would automatically calculate whatever you transferred in the hours you'd taken at that institution, and it would give you predictability at the end, and I love it in red, you know, where it goes, oops. And it would say you have blank semesters based on your past history at an average cost of blah, blah, blah. Why can't we do something fun like that this population understands?
Well, a variation of that.
It's all possible, and that's what you're describing is easy to do. Super easy.
Can you do it for us?
No. Well, you know, all of these charts and graphs that you all have where immediately everything changes based on what you do. I mean, it's pre-programmed. It's easy. I mean, not for me.
They're actually some
Not for me either, but
at one time, A&M, you'd have a degree plan, and they didn't intend this, but there's this little dotted line that when you completed courses, it go under the line. So it was almost an unintentional bar chart, so you would see your progress. It was pretty clear, and this is, again, a few years ago. I don't know if they still do that, but it was. I've thought of that frequently because it told you exactly where you stood. Now the problem is that students can deviate from that usually very easily, and it was proposed 2 sessions ago that students needed to have a degree plan by 30 hours, and if they deviate from the plan, they needed to go to their advisor before they enrolled in the course. Well, it ended up 45 hours, and you don't have to go to your advisor if you deviate from it. The type thing you talked about would be very helpful.
Through all your strategies, which you've talked about today, many times besides the favorite one, which is convene a statewide group, okay? The other is to better inform, to better educate the users of the system, or the parents, or the blah blah, or the blah blah. And I'm just talking about coming to San Antonio and get a bunch of those, rackers from Rackspace and get those kids for 4 hours or 12 hours locked in their downtown camps on their mattresses, and let them have at it. Because they're going to speak to our student population and demographically do that in a way that they'll get.
I think that's great, and you could also tie in the finance part of it as well, so they can actually see, if I deviate this way, it's going to cost me $10,000 if I change. I mean, I still remember someone talking about a student who was an anthropology major and wanted to major in business, and that's why it took her so many hours, and she was about to be a senior. I might have been wrong, but I would have advised her to finish her degree and get an MBA. It would have taken the same amount of time. Probably
get a corporate.
Tell us where they live, and we'll find them.
Maybe we could get a corporate sponsor to do that for us.
Yeah. Steve?
I just wrote it down.
I saw you writing. I was hoping.
What's the name of the program at
Kathy, I think that's a great idea.
It is a great idea.
I think it's an absolutely wonderful idea. So I'd be very willing to follow up on it.
Is that
What's the name of the program at the University of Virginia where they require 15 hours a semester? Is there a name to that program at UVA? Does anybody know? And it's like everyone takes 15 hours a semester and graduate. They have it all.
There are a number of states or universities that have initiatives like that. Hawaii has 15 to finish. Some other states, Complete College America's promoting that concept all over the country.
Yeah. It just makes sense. And the 30 hours a year, however they do it. And a lot of those can be, online courses or summer courses. That makes sense. But to promote that philosophy, because we have not done that in the past. Our own children do not think like that.
I think that's exactly right. But I think you also have to combine it with what Kathy was talking about, because you can take 15 hours every semester and still end up with 140 or 150.
Yeah. You got to take the right 15 hours.
That's right. Yeah. So you combine the two, and I think you're right there.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
You know what the consequences are.
Right. Yeah.
Virginia knows what they're doing. Their 4-year graduation rate's about 94%.
No.
Awesome. There you go. Best practices. Copy that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well trained.
Well, they have a couple of schools, more than just Virginia. I think William and Mary's is very, very high. I'm not sure about Virginia Commonwealth, but okay.
Okay. Well, I think the issue that would be before us here would be 2 or 1 meeting or no meetings between now and July 23rd. So I get a sense of the committee. I guess my sense is that 2 meetings is too many. not having any meetings might be a risk of not being ready on as we could have been on the 23rd. So if we only at least plan for one meeting, then the question is when should that be? And June 4th might be too soon. So we might want to look at something. And July 9th is perhaps too late. And I'm trying to get what's your thoughts from staff, David?
I'm concerned about your schedules. I mean, we can work with. We were anticipating having to work with June 4th, so it would be easier if we didn't have to, but we can work with that. So we leave that up to you.
Why don't we do this? Why don't we circulate with Larry and I first about a later date, and then we'll still plan on June 4th, but we'll circulate a later backup date, and we'll see what the attendance is. And if it looks like we're going to lose a lot of people, then we'll stay with June 4th.
Woody, let me inject in here that when I take on an assignment like this and I see a schedule in here, I try to plan my time around that schedule. And I have scheduled June 4th. Okay. June 5th, I have an airplane ticket.
Okay.
And I think that's probably fairly consistent, especially during the summer programs when, summer times in here, that very difficult to reschedule things in here. And so I would urge us to stick with the 4th.
Okay.
We can do that.
All right, let's stay with the 4th. The staff, unless you and I talk and you say it's not going to work, and then the next meeting will be really July 9th, because I fully understand. I mean, I've got a pretty full schedule. So, but let's plan on June 4th. If we think at June 4th we're ready, then we can pass on July 9th, and then hopefully everybody can be here on July 23rd.
Sounds good.
Very good.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
Could I have one more?
Yes, Bob.
Take a picture of the committee if you don't mind.
Taking a picture of the committee? This is just a comment to the staff, and it's a personal one that I always cringe at when there's certain words come out, and one of them is innovation. And I find that innovation usually comes up when you don't have an idea what you need to do, and so it's a crutch that comes in and says, okay, we're going to solve it by being innovative. I would hope that we would minimize the use of that word.
Okay, we have a photo.
It's an innovative idea.
You want to pose for a photo, or what?
Are we supposed to look at work?
Are we supposed to be here? Are we supposed to be up? Or over here? Okay. Okay. Well, meeting's adjourned as soon as we get our photo taken.
Yeah, because the next one may go a long time, may not. I think we got.